have a confession. I'm one of those people. The kind of girls who go to Starbucks and perch themselves at a table in the corner and spend the day there working. Now, in my defense, I don't sit there with a MacBook Air. I'm not a total cliche. I'm an artist and I do life drawings of things I see around the city. Never other people unless they ask or give consent, and sitting by a Starbucks window actually has a purpose. At least that's what I tell myself anyway, instead of just accepting that I'm on the cusp between millennial and Gen Z and a bit of a cliche of both. And during my almost daily visits to local Starbucks, I did notice a guy who kinda fit the cliche I'm insulting. He had an expensive, new-looking MacBook Pro, and he'd sit there throughout the day. Now, occasionally he'd type a sentence or two, often deleting and rewriting them, and then deleting them again, and then going to the barista to order another coffee. Sometimes he'd read these tattered old paperbacks, and I was thrilled to see that there wasn't a Jonathan Franzen, James Joyce, or Thomas Pynchon among them, although I would have given a Pynchon a maybe. Either way, it was clear that he was as much of a literary nerd as me, but like me, and unlike much of our generation, he wasn't pretending to read Ulysses or Gravity's Rainbow. And did you know, and I found this out from a Tinder date who was funny and honest, that some men crack the spines of their intellectual books to make it look like they've read them just to impress chicks. Now, I will admit, honestly, that did earn him a few more dates until he had to move out of state to look after a sick mom, and that kind of sucked. So back to Starbucks writer man, he was cute in a bookish, tousled blonde hair, slightly dad bod way, i.e. exactly my type. Now, I'm not exactly shy, and if I'm attracted to a guy, then I won't make a secret of checking him out, but I also won't make the first move. I can't completely kill the age of chivalry for 8th wave feminism or whatever wave we're on now. Now anyway, I was pretty psyched and a little thrilled when I caught writer guy checking me out. I'd worn the most manic pixie dream girl outfit I could think of. A plaid skirt, a beret, and some blouse or other I forget. Yes, I know I'm a cliche. Now wait until you find out that I'm an artist, but I'm a cool artist. I draw comics, nothing for the big two yet, but I have worked on a couple of titles from comic publishers you definitely have heard of. And at the time though, I was still building up my portfolio, so I was mostly doing sketches and perspective practices and poses and things, rather than Spider-Man punching the crap out of the Shocker. Dream panel to draw though. Anyways. Writer guy first approached me by casually passing by my table after buying his 3rd latte of the day. He pretended to tie his shoe and asked if I minded him placing the latte on the table. I said go ahead, it was no problem, and he said something about how he wouldn't want to spill his latte on my sketchbook. And then to his credit, he said something like, "I see you're an artist," instead of asking if I was, when he could see full well that I was an artist. And I told him that yeah, I was, and we ended up having an hour-long conversation about comics, still life, perspective, all sorts of things. And it was clear that he didn't know a ton about composition and the various nerdy details I was bringing up. But again, to his credit, he listened and seemed to pay attention without interrupting. When I was done talking, I asked him what kind of writer he was. Now here was where things got a little odd because he was extremely cagey about it. I tried to flirtily coax the details from him, but all I could discover was that he wrote a combination of fact and fiction, meddled with metafiction, and was settling on a style. Now, over the next few weeks, we hung out every now and then at the coffee shop. Not for long, we both had work to do, but if we saw each other there, then we'd have a little chat. I appreciated that he wasn't the type of guy who'd make a note of my schedule and turn up exactly whenever I did. I don't know, I guess being terminally online left me on high alert for red flags. And yes, the Starbucks had free Wi-Fi, so I really was terminally online, and I just wasn't seeing any red flags at all. And it turns out that the reason that I wasn't seeing any small red flags was because the guy was just one giant walking, talking red flag, and I guess I was colorblind. Now, the more we talked, the more we learned about each other. Which, thinking about it, isn't true at all. We learned about each other's artistic ambitions, writing and drawing, and I asked him some things about his life. He was currently between salary jobs, living in his buddy's spare room trying to build a Twitch career in the evenings for if this writing thing didn't work out. And I remember him saying that he was a big fan of Moist Critical, and me telling him the word moist grossed me out, a word which he then used to tease me a lot. And I laughed throughout it, but in retrospect it was kind of weird. Like, yeah bro, my coffee is moist. The towelette is moist. I get it, you're trying to be flirty. And still a cave woman trying to headbutt the cave wall to create a shelf, I was too stupid to see any of the signs. I should add here, for anyone confused about the timelines, this went down in the summer of 2022. Starbucks had long since dropped their mandatory masking policy in most locations, and ours was one of them, thank God. I don't think I could have spent an entire day every day wearing those stupid things. Now, I didn't notice at the time, and looking back, I don't think Writer Guy really asked anything meaningful about me. I mean, there wasn't much to tell, but it would have been nice for him to show some interest in the degree that I'd studied. Surprisingly, nothing to do with art, an interesting story in and of itself, I think. Or what my family situation was, if I had siblings, one much older stepbrother and 3 sisters, one of whom at the time was basically an 18-year-old Karen. And he just showed no interest in my life outside of Starbucks other than my plans as an artist and career aspirations. Mostly he talked about how he wanted to get an agent, wanted to get a publishing deal, wanted to be the next big name in the literary world, etc., etc. Like, a lot, and repetitively. And you know what I decided at the time? I convinced myself that his shallow conversation was because he was building up to ask me out, and he was super awkward and shy about it. Yeah, the dude had no game, and that was pretty obvious, so latching onto the few things that we had in common, then repeating them, it made some sense to me. The dumbest part, at this stage I would have said yes if he just asked me out, and then I would have made sure that he found out more about me and vice versa. It had been a while since I dated, and thanks to the last couple of years, so I blame that for my bad judgment. Eventually I decided that if I was going to get some, I had to act. Even a movie date would do, and second base would be great, third base would be more than enough, just literally anything. A date, a kiss, a modicum of interest from a guy who very clearly did find me attractive, considering how often I caught him checking me out. And I decided that the best way forward was to start being as flirty as I could with him without looking like a desperate, well, you know. And so one day, I had this great plan. Instead of buying our usual coffees from the counter so he'd see me come in, I drove through the drive-thru and bought our drinks that way. So when I entered the cafe, which thankfully didn't have a bell over the door, he wouldn't notice me as he sat writing facing my usual table, which was near the side window that looked out onto one particular street that I was fond of. I handled the door like a pro despite holding 2 coffees and crept up on Writer Guy. And the first thing I noticed was that there was actually text on the page. Now, maybe I'm the a-hole here because he always refused to tell me what he wrote because it wasn't ready, quote-unquote. But I couldn't help taking a peek before surprising him with the drinks. And what I saw made my jaw drop. And hey, I'm not a writer, so I'm not allowed to use dumb cliches like that, but I can't remember it word for word, obviously, but I do remember that he was writing in size 16 font or something ridiculous, which was extremely helpful. He was on chapter 5, and it began talking about how we'd established over the last chapters that by default, women are, well, words I can't really ask you to say on YouTube, and they're typically reserved for women of the night. And below that, he had written that he met a new girlfriend, and while she clearly was as loose as the others, she seemed to like him compared to other women. He had then written a screed about how, because he had me around his little finger, he could use my artistic talents to draw a comic he'd written, which would involve a character based on me who he could persuade to draw naked. Bonus points if I'd allow him to take reference photos. It was some kind of dramatically misguided pickup artist book coupled with an autobiography of how a loser like him had duped a hot chick like me. And I just stood there and read it all 3 times and then walked to the side of the table, placed his coffee down and told him that I bought this for him as a surprise. But that it turned out he was the one to surprise me. And at first he didn't understand what I meant until he saw me looking at the laptop screen. He slammed it closed and then started screaming that he hadn't given me permission to read his writing and that I was lacking the nuance and understanding to appreciate what he meant and various other things. He basically dug himself a 6-foot hole. The barista, who I also knew through his boyfriend, was a physio trainer and came over and asked if everything was okay. And this writer guy screamed that everything was not okay. I had read his erotic fiction about me without his permission. Again, it was like he wanted to bury himself. And the barista told him that perhaps he'd better leave, while flexing his bicep in very much a type of I could throw you out if I wanted to, buddy type way. Now, writer guy snarked at him and then looked around frantically for something to do. He didn't want to just lose by leaving, and so he grabbed the coffee that I brought him and flung it against the Starbucks logo on the wall. And then, even more fired up, he screamed that I'd ruined everything. Shocking me and the barista, he grabbed up his expensive, new-looking MacBook Pro, I'm pretty sure it was a 16-inch too, and then flung it in anger against the tiled floor of that Starbucks. Now this laptop exploded into these weird pieces of glass and plastic and keyboard keys and circuitry, you name it. And then the writer's guy's eyes widened as if realizing what he'd done, and then he charged out the door, actively beginning to sob. The barista asked me if I wanted to call the cops or anything, but I didn't think it was really worth it. I told him I didn't know the guy's actual name even, but the barista replied that he did, from credit card receipts, and that was a relief at least in case things did escalate, but I was pretty sure they wouldn't. Well, I was wrong. I took a couple of weeks break from visiting that Starbucks just because I didn't like the idea of him spying on me from another store or anything like that, but eventually I was like, screw it. I'm not having my favorite place ruined by that thing. And when I entered, imagine my utter surprise when I saw who was sitting at the table facing my usual seat. Writer guy. And I looked over to the barista, and it was a young girl, maybe just out of high school, and I guess maybe there was no way to warn the other baristas who'd been banned. No security footage or visual footage or anything. And I decided that screw it. I wasn't leaving. I walked up to the counter, ordered my usual, and then told the barista that she might want to watch out for the guy by the door. I said that I had a bad experience with him and he'd been aggressive. She told me the manager didn't actually allow permabans of customers unless the cops had been involved, which explained that. And she also told me, though, that she'd gotten serious creeper vibes from him and how he'd openly stare at her breasts when he talked to her and how he reached out to touch her name badge before she pulled away. And I felt so stupid. How had I ignored all these strange things just because I found him cute? How had I even found him cute in the first place? Not accounting for taste, I suppose, and I guess mine at the time was wannabe PUA who pretends to be a sensitive nice guy. Sadly, a common trope in later years. And as I was heading to my table, writer guy called me over. I contemplated ignoring him, and I knew he was only going to come over to my table if I did, so I walked over there and he immediately started apologizing, groveling and begging, tears in his eyes, all sorts of stuff, and then he started begging me if we could pick up where we left off, because he was certain that an erotic graphic novel featuring the both of us would be a huge seller. Well, that had escalated, and now apparently he evolved into the eroticism as well. I told him that in no uncertain terms was I his girlfriend, and I'd never been his girlfriend. I'd never be writing a graphic novel with him, and I never wanted to see him again. And he just sat there in silence for a moment, and a tiny, tiny part of me hoped that he was genuinely thinking about his actions. Instead, he reached out for the brand new looking MacBook Pro that he'd been writing on. And please just take it and leave it, I thought. And I swear down that he had bought a replacement MacBook Pro, although at least it looked like a 14-incher this time, and now he was snatching that up. Now surely he wasn't going to. And with some shriek of anger, basically a howl, he slammed this new MacBook Pro down onto the floor of that Starbucks. And once again, the ridiculously expensive laptop exploded in a shower of debris and electronic crap. And the guy just stood there, breathing heavily and furiously for a second, and I thought maybe he was going to attack me. And instead, suddenly, it was like all the rage dissipated from his body as he looked down at the second shattered MacBook Pro on the floor, and then he let out a scream and ran out the door. I can't be sure, and maybe this is just cruel wishful thinking, but I'm sure I heard him yell, "Not again, Mom's gonna kill me," or something before the door swung shut. I wouldn't be surprised. Now this time I did get the cops involved, just so that they were able to get him permanently banned from that Starbucks. And it was easy enough for the cops to consider his actions for the destruction of property, even though it was his own property, since the laptops also damaged some of the tiles, so he got banned, and I avoided a living red flag, and I still get to visit my favorite coffee place. Only now, I'm drawing comics for writers whose names you probably haven't heard of and most definitely wouldn't treat me this way. And that's pretty sweet, all told, but the insanity that I experienced with that writer guy, holy crap. Maybe one day that could make for a comic book of its own. Maybe he was just on drugs. It was the summer of 1996. The world was in turmoil, probably, I can't quite remember. It's always in turmoil. And in truth, I can't remember much about 1996 except that I was 22 in my senior year of college, and I was dating someone named Rhea, the absolute hottest chick I have ever been with before or since, apart from my lovely wife, who, of course, makes my ex in question look like some swamp donkey. But honestly, and my wife has given me permission to say this because she knew Rhea too back in those days, this girl was ethereally beautiful, delicate, elven features, strawberry blonde hair that caught the red in the afternoons and the blonde in the morning. She was stunning when I woke up next to her, even if after our first few nights together she'd jokingly freak out that I saw her without makeup. And she was the kind of girl who applied it in a way that the average dude would say that she didn't wear makeup at all. If I hadn't seen her spend an hour at the mirror painstakingly contouring her face in the most subtle manner, I would have thought that her beauty was entirely natural, and of course it was. She just amplified it in these gentle ways. And to call her a goddess feels wrong because she wasn't some kind of all-powerful being who commanded men and dominated a room. She was more like the most beautiful specter you've ever seen, or a fairy made human. At least, all of this was how she looked. As a person, she was kind of, let's just say, neurotic. She had specific things that she'd focus on. She wasn't autistic or anything like that, she just had weird things that she'd focus on. For example, if she wore a short skirt when we went out, she'd regularly ask me if she was accidentally flashing people. If I said no, it was just hanging just fine, then she'd just shrug and drop it. If I said that it was a bit windy so people might have seen a brief glimpse of the side of her underwear, she'd just shrug and drop it. She'd regularly ask me how many beers we had in the fridge, and if we had less than 4, she'd make me go on a grocery run to top it off to at least 6. And she didn't even drink beer. She collected CDs, but I don't think that I'd ever heard her listen to anything but the radio. Just these weird little quirks that for various reasons I'm pretty sure that she did deliberately because she was trying to be cute. It was the era of the quirky girl, and she'd often say things like, "I was born in the wrong era." But when I asked her what era she should have been born in, she'd think about it and then say, "This one, I guess." Now, I'm making her sound nuts, but this really was about 2% of her behavior. For the most part, we had a normal, healthy relationship. She liked going out for drinks and hanging with my friends, and she had one best friend who was also kinda hot, and while she was very friendly towards me, at the time I was convinced that she had a thing for Rhea. And my friends, who were all just regular guys around our age, were naturally kinda jealous that I'd hooked up with this elven princess. I was kind of the leader of that gang though, and I worked out a lot, and I think they all knew that I probably would have knocked them the F out if I'd caught them hitting on Rhea. And of course, her hot friend Cedar, yeah, apparently that's her real name, claimed to be married to a Russian in prison for murder. And she seemed to take great delight in shutting my friends down if they so much as put their arm around her. And plot twist, because it's not a very interesting way to end the story, Cedar was not in fact married to a Russian murderer, and that was just some crap Rhea made up, and Cedar is now my beautiful wife with whom I have 2 beautiful children. Now anyway, with all that out of the way, back to Rhea's other main obsession, and this one did impact our relationship a decent amount. Rhea was absolutely obsessed with the idea of making money in the most unusual ways. She didn't want to get rich, she didn't care how much money she had, she just wanted to find money-making schemes that would get people talking. We were both fairly well off thanks to some inheritance and kind parents respectively, so it's not like she needed to focus on anything but grad school. And we were both studying various STEM subjects, and realistically it was a complete waste of time for either of us to go looking for work. But that wasn't what it was about for Rhea. She wanted to get paid, any kind of amount, for something unusual, and it was the strangest quirk I've maybe ever seen in a person. Now, for examples, she charged a local grocery store owner $10 to paint a huge, beautiful mural on the side of her store that pointed into the yard. And the creation of the mural and hiring a few people to help meant that she ended up at a loss of $190. She didn't care. She'd been paid $10 to paint a mural in the city, which is something very few people could claim. Another example, and okay, this one was kind of cool and I was a little jealous that she landed that job and I didn't. She spent one Halloween working as a murderous clown schoolgirl in a haunted house, where her sole job was to jump out, yell boo, giggle, and then run away. She took the job for $3 an hour and worked 10 hours a day for a week, and to her, that was a win. Finally, she hit me with the craziest idea yet. So, a week prior, we'd watched the movie Forrest Gump. She began the conversation by sort of coyly asking if I remembered the movie well, which obviously I did. It was the previous week. And I told her yes, and she replied saying the movie had given her an ideal money-making idea. I was expecting her to suggest some kind of walking initiative where people donated to her, or probably me, trailing behind, holding the donation bucket until she got bored. No, I couldn't have been more wrong. She asked me if I remembered the scene where Jenny, Forrest's one true love, plays guitar in the club. Now, I did remember it because it was kind of notable, obviously, and if you haven't seen the movie, she performs naked, and her nudity is covered up by the guitar. And so this was Rhea's plan. She was going to pitch the idea to small, artsy bars and clubs that she played raw acoustic songs, well, raw and naked. And this is someone who wouldn't wear a bikini to the beach and was only really comfortable showing off her legs, and certainly nothing above the waist or definitely between it. And even with me, she wasn't exactly the type to just stroll around the apartment nude, and after bedroom activities, she almost scrambled to pull a robe on or something. And here she was, wanting to basically perform guitar pieces naked in front of a bunch of artsy strangers. And I tried to explain to her that it wasn't like the movie. They used clever cuts and camera angles to avoid the fact that Jenny could have almost certainly been seen totally naked by a number of patrons, not to mention the backstage people, etc. And Rhea told me that no, she was confident she could manage to pull it off without actually revealing her body to anyone. And I decided to just leave that and move on to asking her about the performance itself. And it turns out that she'd never tried to attempt to learn the guitar. I could play the guitar pretty well, actually, to the point that I was in a pretty amateurish unsigned band. And so, of course, I was roped into teaching her guitar. But she was hopeless. We practiced and practiced and practiced, and even though I kept advising her that she was over-practicing and making things harder, she was having none of it. And eventually she could successfully strum a G chord and occasionally switch from a G to a shaky C and then back again. And Rhea decided that this was enough for now, and she was on track to become a guitarist. And besides, acoustic performances were meant to be raw and simplistic. I wasn't prepared to argue this, so I just asked her to let me hear her sing. And I imagined that at least she was one of those girls who sang in her hairbrush in the mirror, and given how beautiful her speaking voice was, I was at least expecting something. Imagine a cat being strangled. Now imagine a cat being strangled while having a cactus shoved where no cactus should go. The sound that cat made would be melodic compared to Rhea's singing. I genuinely couldn't even work out what song she was attempting, and when she told me it was Patti Smith's song with a title I most certainly can't say on YouTube, you could have knocked me down with a butterfly. She asked me if she was as good as she'd been told and if she was ready to sing in bars. And I had two choices here. I could let my girlfriend have the most embarrassing night of her life, or I could tell her the truth and take the heat for a day or so. And I opted for the latter. And Rhea absolutely lost it. I'd never seen her behave like this before, not even close. And she began shrieking, just these noises aimed at nobody in particular, running her hands through her hair like she was shampooing it. And that's when she told me that she'd booked her first gig for 2 weeks from then. And it was at the local open mic basement bar run by one of our friends that we knew. We knew everyone there. Our friends hung out there. My ex, who was on great terms with, was the bartender, and this basically meant that not only would our entire friendship group see my girlfriend nude, no matter how convinced she was that she could keep herself covered, it also meant that they'd hear her acting like an absolute mental patient while taking herself completely seriously. I considered the idea of trying to persuade her to present it as comedy, or maybe even anti-comedy, or freaking something that wouldn't end in an unmitigated disaster. And I begged her to cancel it, and before I could even react, she grabbed up my old acoustic guitar that we'd been using to learn and smashed it over my head. No, it knocked me unconscious probably for like 10 seconds, I think, and I'm lucky as hell that my head is apparently very hard because it caused the strings to snap instead of cutting too deep into my scalp. There was blood though, and splinters that were dangerously close to my eyes and lips. I carefully stood up, holding my head downwards to make sure that I didn't get wood in my eyes, and this means that I missed Rhea's grand exit. And all I could hear was, "I'm leaving forever," and the door slamming behind her. Now, of course, she didn't leave forever. She had to awkwardly return a few days later to get some things, which took up about half the apartment. She tried apologizing to me, but it was the kind of apology where she clearly just wanted me to see her side. And along with that, she'd smashed my old acoustic guitar over my freaking head. That instrument had been inherited from my grandfather and had survived a number of middle school, high school, and college parties and bonfires. Don't worry though, I never played Wonderwall or Stairway. Now anyways, I essentially threw Rhea out and then time passed on. I had to visit the bar on the night of her supposed first performance just so I could try and stop it, but thankfully she wasn't there. Her friend, as you know, my now wife, Cedar, was there though, and it turns out we were both there to prevent Rhea from making a complete nude ass of herself, pun intended. Cedar and I drew closer over time, and I soon discovered that there was a side to Rhea that I'd never seen. Apparently, she'd been known as a queen bee mean girl in high school and had only befriended Cedar in college after Cedar had lost a bunch of weight and gotten hot. And some of the old stories that she told me about Rhea from high school were just downright deranged. For example, she performed a solo dance routine at the school talent show, changing her song and choreography at the last minute and then screaming at the audience when they didn't give her a standing ovation. She decided that certain girls, and even a few of the more docile boys, had slighted her in some way, so she'd go out of her way to sabotage them and get them into trouble while remaining sneaky clean. And when I asked Cedar why she'd become friends with Rhea and why she'd never warned any of us, she became quiet and introspective. Eventually, she admitted to me that she was a pretty devout Christian, and she believed in forgiveness and allowing people to change, and that Rhea had completely managed to convince her during college that she was a much better person. I couldn't blame her. I haven't even suspected this side of her. And shortly after, Cedar and I began dating, and as usual, we hung out with our friend group at that bar. It was open mic night, and who should take the stage but Rhea, clutching a tiny pink ukulele. Now, I was deeply relieved to find that she was fully clothed instead of trying to cover all of her most intimate bits with a tiny uke. Now, what followed was somehow even worse than the guitar performances. And by the end, even some of our friends were screaming to get off the stage and never come back. Cedar and I decided to sneak out the back door. Unfortunately, I froze when I heard Rhea scream my name, and she began screaming that I was the guy who sabotaged her music career. She claimed that I'd somehow made her bad at playing guitar, and she insisted that I tried to persuade her to perform nude, and what a creep this made me. And of course, most of my friends knew at least part of the story and knew it was all nonsense. And I just turned to leave, but Cedar shouted out for me to watch out. Rhea had hurled her little pink ukulele neck over head straight towards me, almost like a throwing axe. Now, thankfully, I was able to dodge the uke, which shattered into some pieces in one of the concrete pillars that held up the bar. I could see the fury in her eyes, though, and I knew it wasn't over. This time she grabbed a beer glass that was almost full, much to the anger of the guy who'd been about to take a sip from it, and she flung it, but of course she had no hope of hitting me from that distance. Now that didn't stop our little military buddy Sid from stepping in the way of that glass anyways, though, and unfortunately it did hit him and shattered right into his face. I'd never seen anything like it. There were shards of glass everywhere, and some of them were even sticking out of Sid's cheek. One thin shard was pierced almost through his nose, and a sliver had gone right through his lip. Now, worse was the long, bloody piece that was a fraction of an inch below his eye socket. And you know what the goddamn legend did? He turned to me, he grinned, causing more blood to pour from his face, and said, "Told you I'd take a bullet for you one day." Now, thankfully, Sid didn't need any convincing. He just obviously pressed charges against Rhea, who quite clearly either had some kind of mental illness or severe anger management issues. And even though I don't quite agree, the courts ruled that she was perfectly sane to stand trial, and she spent 6 months in prison, 2 years on probation, and some fairly lengthy stint of anger management therapy when she came out. Naturally, Cedar and I also took a restraining order out against her, which was granted. No, I have no idea what's become of Rhea now, and I'm not sure I want to know. I'm a woman in my 20s, and I've been a long-time listener. I never had the guts to write this out before because I can't write to save my life, but I'll give it a go anyway. And you know what they say, you miss every shot you don't take. Now, I'm generally quite a mousy, quiet woman who keeps to herself. I work in a bookstore, and I like to listen to true crime podcasts, just like yours, and I watch Netflix. I'm really boring, and I'm not ashamed of that fact. I learned early on that excitement isn't always positive and isn't always what it's cracked up to be, and you can thank dear old mom and dad for that and the absolute pig-poo effort that they made in raising me. Thankfully, my older sister was there to make sure that I was always fed, cleaned, and that my clothes smelled at least relatively fresh. I love you, Audrey. I wouldn't have made it this far in life without you. Now, thankfully, this creepy story doesn't involve something terrible happening to my older sister, but it does once again show her looking out for her little brat kid sis. And when I was in middle school, I was the most awkward, gangly preteen you could possibly imagine. Actually a pretty short queen, but as I was growing up, my body felt like it was all arms and legs and elbows and knees. And my hair was a constant curly mess that I regularly burned with straighteners until Odd showed me how to actually use them. And oh yeah, I had braces and a retainer, and in high school, guess what? Acne. And it might seem like I'm being harsh on myself, but I was the ugly duckling. I'm actually pretty happy with how I look now, so I guess the years of suffering were worth it. There was a reason for this rambling, though. I'm sorry. During our first semester of our last year at middle school, one of the coolest boys in my year asked me out. Now, looking back, he was a complete try-hard emo, but he smoked behind the gym, and he wore a black trench coat, and he said the F word in front of the teachers. He was a rebel, and he told me that he wanted to be my boyfriend. At first, I said no because I thought that it had to be a prank. And it soon became clear that it wasn't, though, and for 6 months, I dated the guy who I thought was the most badass guy in our year. And I'm pretty sure people laughed at him behind his back and to his face, but he always hid that from me, and I never stopped thinking that he was the coolest guy since the Fonz himself. Anyway, my cool emo boyfriend was named, or at least nicknamed, Cheese. And he never would tell me why, but he seemed to like the nickname and was cool with me calling him Cheese, and so I did. And then one day, without any warning, he told me that he was leaving school after the weekend and moving to a different state because his father had been reassigned to the New York office. I think he was a lawyer or a hedge manager or something like that. I thought Cheese was joking. He had a habit of teasing me with things like we are breaking up or so-and-so is dead, and he'd just seen the principal and our teacher doing it in the closet, and a baby popped out and looked at him, and that was a Simpsons joke, so I always remember that one. Turns out he wasn't kidding, and he simply never showed up to school on Monday. Didn't leave me some forwarding address, didn't call me, just completely ghosted me. Maybe that was the prank. Maybe he'd always known that he'd be leaving then. Jump forward 13 years. I'm sitting in my local coffee shop making use of their Wi-Fi when I get a Facebook friend request. Now it's from someone called Nathan Lester, and his profile picture is just some anime ninja. Now anyway, I didn't deny the friend request. I never got friend requests really, but I didn't accept it either. And when I clicked on his profile, I saw that we had 3 mutual friends, all from middle school. And a message request pinged, so I accepted it. Hi, it's Cheese from middle school. And that's when I realized Nathan Lester, Red Lester, is a kind of cheese especially popular over in the UK. That's probably how he got that nickname. We chatted on Facebook for a few days, and he was kind of very talky, reminiscing on old times that I'd barely even thought about or even remembered. And it worried me a little, but maybe he was just excited to reconnect with an old friend. Now, he had moved around the country due to his father's job after all, and I accepted his friend request and saw that he was a self-employed freelancer who'd graduated college. And despite feeling like a stalker, I went through all of his photos, which I couldn't find a single one of him. They were all animated characters, mostly anime, and a bunch of pictures of cats, which was adorable. And eventually he asked me if I wanted to meet him in a public place to catch up. And the fact that he specified a public place really put me, I guess, at ease. Some guys will wait for girls to suggest that just in case they can get us back to their apartments for a one-night stand. I suggested my local coffee shop, and to my surprise, he said that he was a regular too. I'd never seen him there, but I visited in the mornings. Maybe he was an afternoon guy. And when I showed up, I was the only customer in the cafe. I said hi to the employees, who I was vaguely friends with, and sat down. Now, I'm really going to try and be mean in the next part, but facts are facts. As I was drinking my coffee and reading my book, a short, portly man in cargo shorts and a t-shirt with holes in it sat down opposite me. I told him, as politely as I could, that I was waiting for someone, and he said something like, "Wait no more. Cheese is here." Well, darn. This was him. And when I spoke, I could see that most of his teeth looked disgusting. His skin was terribly unwashed and greasy, and he was balding in the way that had given himself a comb-over in this sort of monk's hairstyle. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with being bald. Most women actually find it pretty attractive, so if you do start losing your hair early, my advice is to not make yourself look like a serial killer. Now, we haven't even begun talking when Cheese told me that he needed a huge favor, and could I loan him $500 to pay off a credit card. He said that he'd be able to get me the money back in 6 months to a year. I told him I didn't remotely have the kind of money to lend him. Now, this wasn't entirely true, but profusely apologized, and deep down, I was pretty furious though. I gave him the benefit of the doubt because he started talking about our times in middle school like they were the best years of his life. And then it kind of made me sad when I realized that this might actually be true. Unfortunately, he ruined that when he kept referring to our meetup as a date, and then he told me that he'd never met another girl like me, and in fact, he'd never dated anyone since our little tryst in middle school. And believe it or not, we didn't even kiss, because I was the one for him, and we were destined to be together. Now, trying to be as pleasant as I could, I told him that I'd been under the impression that this was just a friendly catch-up. And then he asked if I'd dated anyone since him, which obviously yes, I had. And next came the "are you a virgin" question. Oh my god, come on, dude. I'm 25 and I just told you I had previous adult relationships. Do you really need to know if we did the deed? And here I lied and told him that I actually had a boyfriend now and that I didn't think that he'd be very happy with the way this meeting was going, so maybe I should just leave. He yelled something like, "Not if I leave first," and stormed out, leaving me with some bill for the various coffees and 3 expensive cakes that he'd ordered. As I was driving home, I called Audrey, or Officer Audrey as I teasingly called her, because, yeah, my older, protective sister had gone on to be a cop. And when I returned to my apartment, the ancient receptionist told me that a delivery man had taken a package up for me and then left. Now, this wasn't alarming by itself. I ordered from Amazon pretty often, and when I reached my hallway, I couldn't see any package on the ground, though. But what I did see was a replica ninja throwing star there and a dent in the door where someone had clearly tried and failed to stab it into the door as some type of threat. Instead, stuck next to the groove with a little sticky tack was a note that read, "I'll see you again." Of course, Officer Audrey absolutely refused to let me stay alone. She was currently living with her boyfriend, who I was pretty friendly with, so I assumed that I'd just sleep on the couch over there for a while. Audrey surprised me, though, by saying that she was coming to stay at my apartment. That way, if Cheese did try anything, then Big Sister Cop would be waiting for him. Now, after a few nights of Audrey sleeping at my place, we heard a banging on the door. It wasn't like a knocking, but a sound as if someone was trying to kick the door open. The door barely even shuddered, so the intruder wasn't exactly the most competent. Audrey called some of her on-duty buddies while I tried to listen through the door. Unfortunately, my apartment had been bust into during a SWAT raid before I moved in, and the door that they'd installed as a replacement didn't have a peephole. And sadly, I wasn't able to see whether this assailant was Cheese or if this was just some insane coincidence. Now, before I could really act, Audrey decided that she was bored of waiting for her backup and threw the door open inwards. Now, even though she shouldn't have because she was off duty, Audrey held up her gun. She didn't point it at the door kicker, she just held it up in that position that cops do. And it was Cheese at the door. All 300 sweaty, heavy-breathing pounds of him. And this wasn't my point of concern, though. My biggest concern was the large, thin sword that Cheese was holding over his shoulder like some kind of martial arts movie protagonist. Audrey shoved me out of the way, and Cheese brought that sword down hard on her shoulder. It cut into her flesh, but just the flesh, as this sword was clearly just some replica that Cheese had sharpened, and it wasn't a good replica either because it shattered into pieces as it caused the flesh wound on Aubrey's left shoulder. But, oh hell, you don't attack a cop with a sword, especially when 3 of her unit buddies burst into the hallway and tased the absolute crap out of Cheese. But not to be crude, but I mean that literally, he did in fact defecate himself during the tasing. And later, Audrey told me that that's not really something that happens from being tased, so he must have just soiled himself in fear from being charged by multiple cops and the realization that he just shattered his probably most expensive replica sword against a 4th cop's shoulder. The cops took Cheese in, and while Audrey tried to tell me about the night he spent in the cell, I didn't really want to hear it. I kind of felt bad for the guy because there was something clearly wrong with his head. And the way me and Odd had grown up, our horrible trailer park mother and her string of drug dealer boyfriends, I know that sometimes while you can come out the other side a better person, there are other times where you end up broken. And that's exactly what Cheese's lawyers managed to argue. He wasn't of sound mind and he wasn't fit to stand trial. His living conditions were almost untenable and he was deemed a vulnerable individual. And as such, it was ruled that he wasn't fit to stand trial and instead spent an unknown amount of time in some mental health facility. Now, this wasn't years ago, so for all I know, he's still there. It was sad that he suffered, but I'm still a tiny bit skeptical that he had zero responsibility for his actions. Up until our very last encounter, he seemed to know what he was doing and what his plans were. And the only plus side to the whole thing was that Audrey gets to tell people that she was sliced by a samurai sword, and And if people ask me to share a fun fact about myself, I tell them that I once dated an evil ninja. I'm 44 now, and this all went down exactly 10 years ago. And as much as I adore my son, I did think that I was kind of resigned to a life as a single father. Now listeners, please don't crucify me, but in my experience, it's very hard for a single dad with a young male child to find a long-term partner. Maybe there's some scientific reason for this, or maybe I just get really unlucky. And I had it clear and visible on my profile that I had a wonderful 5-year-old son, and whenever I'd swipe right, they'd never swipe right back. Just for those worrying, he 100% knows that I don't blame him for this and never did. We've always been best friends, and he's an extremely smart kid. And on the rare occasions I did get a date, she almost always claimed that she didn't notice the sections where I had a son. Other times you could tell that she was gauging whether I'm hot enough to warrant raising somebody else's kid. No, was the answer apparently. Eventually, I gave up on dating apps and stopped bothering to look for a date at all. As it turns out, my son was staying with his grandparents one weekend, so me and my buddy Jesse decided to go bar hopping on a Friday night. Nothing crazy. We were 30-something-year-old men after all, and we certainly weren't going to hang out in clubs where the next oldest person was 22. But there's a surprisingly large amount of nightlife for the 30 to 40-year-olds in Chicago, and we found ourselves having a lot of fun, more than we'd expected. Now, eventually I met a woman who said that she was 28 and looked it too, and actually was. Sometimes people lie about their ages in places like this, but why bother? We all look and act our age, even if some age differently than others. Now, we ended up getting a little bit drunk and taking a taxi home. I was a gentleman and offered her my bed while I slept on the couch. Main rule, no drunken sex with someone I'm not married to. And the next day, we both woke up with hangovers and spent the whole day together. And I won't bore you with the details of our courtship, let's just jump to the important stuff. And the woman's name was Sheila. She'd moved in and served as the sort of surrogate mother to my son. And at first, everything was fine. She'd watch him sometimes, help with his homework, do a small share of chores that I used to do as a single dad. And eventually, though, she stopped doing really any of that. She wasn't looking for a job, and I was pretty much paying for everything. And she persuaded me to take a credit card out for us, which, against my better judgment, I did, not even questioning why she wasn't eligible herself. And I guess I was just, I don't know. She was in her 20s, attractive, I was in my 30s. She had a good relationship with my boy, and our intimate life was incredible. Who cared if she left a dish or plate or two lying around the house? It did start to grind me down though, and when Christmas came, I realized that I'd have to borrow some money from my parents in order to be able to fully afford the item that my son wanted. I forgot what it was now, but we'll just pretend it's something really cool. It was mid-November when she broke the final straw. I came home to hear her yelling at my son that he was lazy and stupid for getting a B in English. I discussed with her multiple times that I had issues with his English teacher and her teaching methods, and that my son wasn't to be punished for a less than perfect grade in a subject. And yet here she was, yelling at him, telling him that Santa would be spending his money on Christmas presents for her instead. And then she threatened to smack his butt when he responded with, "You're not my mom." Now, if there's one thing I don't stand for is corporal punishment and threats of violence against my kid. And I stormed in and told Sheila to just leave. Now, she looked at me like she'd just come out of a trance, and then, to much to my surprise, she agreed. She said it was for the best. She just asked if she could have until the weekend to pack all of her stuff together, which seemed reasonable. She'd fully moved in, so she had to fully move out as well. And that afternoon I was working in my office, and I've been able to do more remote work since Sheila, but I typically work from home so I could parent the boy. And I heard the front door opening, some muffled voices and shuffling, and then the door slamming shut. Eventually, I ended the call I was on and made it out into the apartment and saw it was empty and ran into the parking lot. I could see Sheila speeding up in her beat-up junker, and I could see my kid looking through the back window, tears streaming down his face. Immediately, I had to develop a plan. I'd get into my own car, chase Sheila, and drive erratically so the cops pulled me over and I could quickly tell them the situation. I knew I'd have to be careful because this wasn't exactly the quiet part of inner Chicago, and I didn't want to save my son but send some poor baby in a stroller to fly across the street in a deadly impact. And so I think my erratic driving, especially given my profession, more on that later, was more like slight misdemeanors than anything else. I followed Sheila around various corners, swerving around parked cars, speeding, trying to be as safe as possible. And the frustrating thing is, I caught sight of some cop cars a block over, but they didn't seem interested in me. I drove up, following Sheila, and saw the two cop cars and a van had her trapped in a street with another cop car blocking her from reversing. When I saw a female cop hugging my son, I dived out of the car and ran to him. He yelled "Daddy" in these excited tears, so the cops immediately knew to let me through. It turns out that two Chicago PD officers had both clocked me driving erratically and actually knew me. Now, I'm a stay-at-home prosecutor, so I'm not some stranger to a handful of cops. This pair knew that something had to be wrong, so they put a call out for any vehicle that a car with my registration might be pursuing, explaining that I was a junior prosecutor. A helicopter patrol easily identified Sheila's car as being the one that I was following, and they also ran a check and saw that she had multiple outstanding parking tickets in Chicago and a warrant in Iowa that they weren't willing to disclose. Later, I tried accessing her fine, but they'd restricted my access, but fair enough. Now, reunited with my son, I'd never been more happy or more scared. I realized then that losing him would be the most upsetting, devastating thing in my life. He just yelled, "Don't be lame, Dad," from the other side of the room, so I know I'm parenting right. And Sheila was charged with child endangerment and a series of other minor misdemeanors. Obviously, I wasn't allowed to serve as a prosecutor on the case for obvious reasons, but I wish I had. Her lawyers had managed to argue Sheila's way out of a kidnapping charge, and I'm still not happy about that. When she's released, though, she's being sent to Iowa to face whatever mysterious warrant she has waiting for her there. Like I said, I'm 44 now and I haven't dated since Sheila, and frankly, I don't want to. I have family and friends, and nobody could replace my boy's mom anyway, even though he sadly never got to know her as she passed during childbirth. Angela, I love you, and I'm certain that you're up in heaven and you helped keep our son safe that day. I know you'd want me to be happy too, whether that meant I dated again or not, but right now, I have everything in the world I could ask for. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul, and all links are in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, back to the lobby with you. In May 1996, two young women disappeared into the quiet depths of Virginia's Shenandoah Forest and were later found dead at their secluded campsite, bound and silenced far from any trailhead. What should have been a peaceful hiking trip became a grim mystery whispered among the trees. Hear the full story over on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul, linked down below. Now enjoy the stories. More than 3 decades ago, back when I was a much younger man, I helped a mate of mine move down to Glasgow from our home city of Newcastle. He'd managed to get a job as a football scout for Glasgow Rangers, which was basically his dream career. And so while me and all of our mates were sad to see the back of him, we were all really proud of him too. Now, we drove up early in the morning, and then once everything was unloaded, we had some pub grub and a few lagers, shandies for me, and then I started on the drive back to Newcastle. I'd left it quite late to drive back, so it was about midnight by the time I started to see signs for the English borders. The roads were quiet, with only the occasional lorry thundering past me, and I remember there being some phone-in thing on the radio, but I wasn't really listening. I was in my old Vauxhall Cavalier, an '82 model that I bought on the cheap about 4 years prior. It normally served me well, and it had been running fine all day, but just after passing a place called Jedburgh, the temperature warning light flicked on. I looked at my dash, watching the needle climbing into the red, and swore under my breath as I eased off the accelerator. Since it normally bought me a few minutes, I cranked the heater up full blast to try and pull some heat out of the engine. But that time, it seems my luck finally ran out, because just a minute or so later, there was this loud hiss from under the bonnet before steam started pouring out the seams. Seconds later, I heard this horrible metallic knocking sound coming from under the bonnet, and so I coasted over to the hard shoulder and then came to a stop just in time for the engine to seize up completely. And after that, aside from the ticking of my hazard lights and the sound of hot metal cooling down, there was nothing but silence for a few seconds, until I erupted. I remember shouting, "Are you effing kidding me?" a couple of times, and then, after taking a few deep breaths, I got out of the car and tried to fix it. And I tried it for half an hour, and in that time, a grand total of 2 cars passed me, but even with me waving at them as they passed, neither of them stopped. I didn't just stand there like some plonker for the whole 30 minutes, mind you. I popped my bonnet not long after getting out, but when I did, a load of steam and the smell of burnt coolant came wafting up into my face. And after waving away some of the steam, I spotted a crack in the top radiator hose and then noticed how loads of antifreeze was dripping onto the road and forming a big green puddle. I didn't have a spare hose, and neither did I have enough water to top it up properly, and even if I had, the engine had overheated so badly that I didn't trust it not to seize up again. Basically, I wasn't going anywhere in my old Vauxhall, and since there were no mobile phones back then, at least none for the likes of me, I had no choice but to walk if I wanted to get myself some help. Now, I reckon the nearest emergency phone would have been about a mile down the road, maybe more, and so I locked my car, left my hazards flashing, and then started walking along the dark grass verge with a torch in my hand. Now, I thought I'd be on the move for quite a while, but then no sooner had I started walking, I came to a dirt track, previously concealed by a long hedgerow, which led to what looked like a big 3-story farmer's house. Now, I was so happy that I was literally punching the air, because despite the fact that there were no lights switched on the ground floor, there was what looked to be candlelight in both the front-facing upstairs rooms. I felt bad for calling so late, but since the alternative of walking along the motorway was a much more dangerous one, I reckoned that I didn't have much choice. It was a particularly dark night, small moon and cloud cover, so it was only once I got closer to the house that I saw how run down it was. The ground floor windows were either cracked or newspapered over, and there were cracks in the wood too, along with a lot of peeling paint. And as you can imagine, I started to get really bad vibes from the place. But I try not to judge books by their cover too much, because you tend to be rewarded more times than you're burned for it. And so with that in mind, and granted very foolishly, I decided to knock on the door. I didn't knock too loud or aggressively. I didn't want to frighten anyone. But when my first knock got no answer, I knocked a little bit louder. Again, there was complete silence. No footsteps behind the door, no talking inside, nothing. But then after taking a step back and looking up at the top windows, I saw someone peeking out at me from behind a dirty-looking curtain. And I can't lie, it did scare me a bit seeing a pair of eyes staring back at me through the dim light. But as soon as I reacted, the eyes disappeared and I began to hear voices inside the house. Now, it sounded like a fair number of people, maybe half a dozen, and they were whispering like they were talking among themselves. I heard a little voice in my head saying, "They're awake, knock again." But before I could even dismiss it, I heard the sound of someone laughing inside the house. Not loudly, though, more like a muted sort of wheeze as they tried to keep their voice low. The bad vibes that I was getting ramped up to 11, so instead of risking a confrontation with whoever was either living or more likely squatting there, I decided to make a move. I turned around and walked back up the dirt path as fast as I could, looking over my shoulder every so often to make sure that no one was following me. Now, I was quite certain whoever was inside was watching me from those windows, but as long as they didn't follow me, then I didn't mind what they did. I'd almost gotten to the end of the path to where those two wooden gate posts held no gate when I started smelling something strong on the breeze, something that smelled like burning. And then when I turned the corner and could see out onto the road again, I felt this almost involuntary scream jump out of my mouth as I realized what the smell was. It was my car. My car was on fire. Now, I suppose I acted on complete instinct in running over to it because there was absolutely bugger all I could do about putting out that fire. All I could do was just stand there, effing and blinding and looking around for whoever might have done it. But as you can probably guess, there was no one, and the whole area looked deserted. And I knew for a fact that it wasn't. When I realized just how much of a bad situation I truly was in, I started jogging along the road until I got back on the motorway. Now, it was only a 4-lane carriageway, so I could walk along the verge without being in too much danger, but no matter how much danger passing cars posed to me, it still seemed safer than hanging around my burning car in that creepy house. Now, I think probably about a half an hour must have passed with only the odd car going past me, and in that time, I didn't try to get anyone's attention just in case it was the people from the home. I mean, the joke was on them in a sense because that poor cavalier was definitely on her way out, but on the off chance they wanted to do more than just burn my car, I had to be very careful about who I revealed myself to. Now, I was bloody nervous for that first half an hour, but after that, I started to calm down a wee bit. I hadn't seen any cars or anything parked outside the house, and if they really did want to chase me down for whatever reason, I reckoned that I'd have encountered them already. So once I'd calmed down a bit, and after maybe 2 or 3 more cars passed me with me sticking to the trees on the verge, I made my way to the edge of the road and then stuck my thumb out at what looked like a Land Rover of some kind coming my way. Now, it slowed down as the driver saw me, but then instead of switching on the light above the wheel, someone in the passenger seat started shining a torch in my face after lowering their window. And right away, I knew that wasn't promising behavior when I realized whoever was in the car didn't want to be seen, and I turned and started walking away. Now, a second later, I heard a very promising, "Need a lift, pal?" Now, one that was just friendly enough to slow me down and make me think that I might have been overreacting. But then the second I slowed, I turned back to face the car, and the passenger doors opened up and I heard someone shout, "Get him!" Now, I remember running right at the trees at the side of the road. Not along the road where the car would have been able to cut me off, but at and then through the trees and bushes at the side of the road. I remember closing my eyes as I felt things scratching against my face, and then when I opened them, I found that I'd come to a fence on the other side. I hopped over it with speed and power that I didn't even know I had in me. I mean, I was hardly some couch potato back then, but I wasn't exactly in perfect shape either. But I swear, I think I vaulted that fence like an Olympic athlete for fear of what might have happened if those men had caught up with me. It's strange thinking back on it as well, because these days, all I do sometimes is sit and wonder why those people chose to go after me like they did. But in the moment, as I was running, it didn't matter a jot to me. All I knew was that those people were out to get me, and all that mattered in the world was getting away from them in that moment. Now, I ran across this big dark field for what felt like ages, running and running until I couldn't anymore. And then when I got to the other side and spotted a road ahead of me, I swear I saw that same Land Rover driving along the road with someone shining a torch out into the field. I had to change my route and head off at an angle to avoid the Land Rover, and along with anyone to my rear who might have followed me. I had to force myself to run when I didn't think that I could run anymore, and even though I was quite a fit young lad and one pumped full of adrenaline, I soon felt like that I was about to cough up a lung and fall over. In the end, I found myself staggering onto a road and then right back onto another dark field because I was too scared to be out in the open with a car full of blokes trying to find me. I kept on going like that until I came across a small town. And then as I was walking its dark and empty streets, looking for anyone who might be able to help, a police car appeared, and an officer asked what I was doing walking the streets alone like that. When I told him what had happened to me, he told me to jump in the car, and then off we went to the police station for a cup of hot tea and a few biscuits, while I went into more detail about what had happened. As soon as I mentioned the house that I'd stopped by and mentioned how there had been people inside, I remember these two officers giving each other a look because they told me that the people inside must have been squatters. I thought that they might have been, partly because of how run down the house was, but the police confirmed that it was derelict and that there shouldn't have been anyone in there. They said that they'd head over and check it out, but they doubted anyone would be there. Squatters are kind of like rats. They're annoying and sometimes they're dangerous, but they're not stupid, and they just move on someplace else and then maybe return when things all blew over. But in all likelihood, they were gone from that house for good. I remember asking the two policemen why, as in why had they burned my car before trying to hunt me down like that, and the first words out of the policemen's mouths were, "Well, what did you see?" He was convinced that I'd seen them doing something that they shouldn't have been doing, and after spotting my car, which they assumed was still functional, they tried to make sure that I couldn't get away before chasing me down. But that was the thing. I hadn't seen anything, and once I'd established that, all we could think of was that those squatters just wanted to scare me off. One of the policemen said that since they didn't know who I was, they might have assumed that I was some kind of bailiff or law enforcement agent, and at first they might have been worried that I was a policeman, but then when they realized that I wasn't, they must have reckoned that I was fair game for a kicking. And if only to make sure that I was too scared to return. And with nothing else to say, I gave the police the phone number for my flat in Newcastle, and then since I literally lost everything but my wallet, one of them was kind enough to give me a lift to a nearby train station. It was long past dawn by then, so the trains were running, and I didn't have to wait long before I was on my way back to Newcastle. They phoned a few days later saying that that house was empty, and there wasn't much in the way of evidence tying anyone to the arson. They promised to keep their ears to the ground and would let me know immediately if there was any progress, but till then, they advised me to be patient because things like that took time. Sadly, that was the last I heard from the police, marking the end of my first encounter with squatters, and hopefully my last too. I had no idea that those people could be so violent. I mean, call me naive, but the squatters I was familiar with were the hippies who took over empty houses in London in the 60s. I thought that they'd be more into peace protests and drum circles than chasing down strangers. But I suppose times had changed then, and people changed with them. Almost 10 years ago now, way back in September of 2016, I drove all the way from LA to Phoenix to visit an old high school friend. Now, I was 31 and female, but still Hispanic and still small, and I drove out on a Friday and we spent all day Saturday together. And then, even though I planned to drive back home in the mid-afternoon on Sunday, I didn't end up leaving until about 9 p.m. at night. Now I know, I should have left earlier, and I know what I'm about to tell you is basically my own damned fault for not sticking to my plan. But even so, there are still nights sometimes, even all this time later, when I find myself waking up from nightmares with a cold sweat forming on my chest, having relived it all over again in my sleep. It was just after midnight when I rolled into Riverside County after passing over the Arizona state line. Now, a few people were still up in that area, so it wasn't completely dead, but after I passed the airport and the Mesa Verde complex, the 10 got super quiet again, and it seemed like there was no one but me out there for miles and miles. I was just trying to keep myself awake with some music and by blasting some cold air when suddenly I noticed a pair of headlights in my rear view. Someone was coming up on me, and really fast too, and seeing how fast they were going, I honestly figured it was the police. I didn't panic or anything, I wasn't doing anything wrong, and I didn't have anything in the car that I shouldn't have, and so I just sat tight, kept my speed, and let them get closer and closer. When they got so close their headlights were blinding me if I looked up into the rear view, I figured they'd pass and keep going. But they stayed put, right behind me in the same lane, and didn't budge for at least a couple of minutes. I'm trying to figure out if these guys really are cops, because it looked like they were driving in one of those big sliding door vans. Only this one was all blacked out, like even the windows looked like they were tinted. Now, there was nothing on it to say that they were police, and no lights on the top either, so I started getting really nervous thinking, what the hell do these guys want with me? Like I said, they stayed behind me like that for a couple of minutes, and then by the time they dropped back a little, they sped up to try and pass me, and I was actually super relieved. Now, I thought because they weren't trying to follow anymore, I was out of danger, when in reality, I was in more danger than I could have ever even imagined. I just let them pass, because what the heck was I going to do? But then instead of passing me and speeding off, the black van pulled back into the same lane as me, and then started cruising maybe 10 to 15 minutes in front like it was trying to block me. I thought, oh, big deal, right? Like I could just slow down and lose them. But I didn't think that I'd need to, so I didn't. I stayed right where I was, slowing only a little to just a safe distance between us, and then kept on cruising just like the van was. Now, I had no idea what they were up to, and I think maybe curiosity really did almost kill the cat here, because when the van's rear doors swung open, and I saw a man in leathers with some kind of bandana wrapped around his face, I kind of just froze up. I couldn't think of a single good reason why he'd want to open the back doors like that, and for a second I thought that he might be planning on jumping out for some reason. I don't know what I was thinking. All I did was lean on the brake a little and put just a little more feet between myself and that van. I just had no idea that I'd moved right where he wanted me. I dropped back a little more, still wondering what the hell these guys were doing and why they didn't have any plates on the back of their van. I then watched as the man with the bandana around his mouth began to smile at me. I obviously couldn't see his mouth, but I could see it in his eyes. That or the dust was getting to him, because it's like he squinted before turning his back on me and carefully leaning down to grab something. Now, I might sound crazy or dumb to y'all who are reading this back in almost slow-mo, and maybe I was just too tired and slow or naive as heck, but I could not conceive of what he was about to do next, no matter how obvious it seems looking back on it. And so I just watched as the guy hauled something up into his arms, turned around, and then tossed it out onto the freeway in front of him. I saw what it was way too late, and I guess that moment of panic really did slow me down, but I had just enough in me to turn the wheel at just the right moment, so that when that old engine block came bouncing up off the blacktop, it smashed into my windshield on the passenger side and not into me. And once it hit, instinct told me to slam on the brakes, and so that's what I did, bringing my car to a spinning, screeching stop. Before I realized that I was covered in glass and there was basically a giant gaping hole where my windshield used to be. I just remember sitting there and shaking after I turned off my engine, and then I got out, walked to the side of the highway with my phone and dialed 911. And it wasn't until I described exactly what had happened as calmly as I could that I suddenly just broke down when the operator told me to stay on the line while she transferred me to someone. And after that, it was a case of guiding the cops and EMS to where I was so I could be taken to the ER. Aside from a few cuts and some mild whiplash, I was pretty much good to go, but I was reminded of just how lucky I'd been by that doctor. The cops had said the same thing, and that's why I say reminded, but at the time it didn't all the way feel lucky, and it wouldn't for quite some time. I knew I was lucky to be alive, and it wasn't like I was completely blind to how lucky I'd been in that respect, but all I could think about in the months afterwards was, why me? Like, why did they pick me of all the people they could have picked to throw a damn engine at? Like, I know they were trying to kill me. I just want to know what it was about me that made them think, yeah, this is the one. Let's turn her into hamburger meat. The cops didn't find that van or the people inside it, and I don't mean any disrespect to the boys in blue when I say this, but I didn't have much faith that they would. It was a black van, no plates, traveling in the middle of the damn night in the middle of the damn desert, and it might as well have been a ghost. And that fits too, because you know something? It sure as heck haunts me like one. More than 20 years ago now, back when my son James was still in elementary school, we took a trip down to Bethesda, Maryland from New York so he could see his grandma. Now, it was kind of messed up from the start, I guess, because I had something come up at work on the Friday we planned to leave. And this meant that I couldn't get on the road until about 8:30 in the evening, meaning I wouldn't arrive in Bethesda till after midnight at the latest. Now, I called ahead to my mom and made sure that was all okay, and she wasn't happy at having less time with her grandson, but there really wasn't much that could be done. And so after getting her to agree to stay up later than usual, me and James hit the road. About 2 hours into the journey, I stopped at a little gas station in Maryland when I realized I needed a coffee and a bite to eat. James was asleep in the back seat and I was worried about waking him up as I shut my car door, but he was still at that age where when he was out, and his eyes stayed closed after I shut the door. I got one of those big, super strong gas station coffees, a soda for James, and then a bag of those mini powdered donuts because I knew all that sugar would push me through the rest of the way. And then after walking back to my car, I found James was awake. And thinking that shutting my car door really had woken him up, I apologized and then turned in my seat to hand him his drink. And that's when I saw the key ring that he was now holding. At first glance, it looked like a little clown holding a sign of some description. And I asked him what it was while taking a look at it and saw how the clown's little sign read, Flying Plow Circus. It wasn't plastic either, like it was mass-produced. It was wooden and looked almost handmade. And when I asked James where he got it, he said a man had given it to him. Now naturally, this didn't ring any alarm bells at first, and I was about to just let it go. But then I asked when the man gave it to him, to which James replied, "A minute ago. While you were in the store." Again, this didn't scare me like it should have, because I'd locked my door. Now, I'd never leave my kid in an unlocked car like that while I went into a store, and since sleepy 6-year-olds aren't the most reliable and frequently play pretend, I didn't really take them seriously. But that's when James said something along the lines of, "Yeah, he did something funny to the door, like, then it opened, then he told us to go visit sometime." Now, I remember my pulse getting faster as I asked James if he was serious and if he was sure. He told me he wasn't lying and that the man used some kind of wire to open the door. Now, by the time he said that, my heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. I asked what the guy looked like and James just said, "Normal." And then as I got out of my car and looked around the parking lot, I don't think I'd ever been so close to a panic attack in my whole life. I tried to calm myself down as best I could, and then I asked James to tell me the whole story again from start to finish. He was starting to pick up on my vibe, so he was starting to get all confused and kind of upset, and I had to assure him that he hadn't done anything wrong and that he just needed to tell me what happened, and then he went over it with me a second time. It made my skin crawl to think about, and it still does. The thought of some creep watching people, waiting for an opportunity to break into someone's car so they could creep on their kid. Like, I know all the guy did was give James a keyring, but that's his cover story, right? All he's doing is giving the kid a keyring till the parents take too long coming back, and then it's diddling or abduction time. I asked James if he said or did anything weird, or if he acted in a weird or creepy way, and James said the only weird thing he said was, "Your dad knows me." And even though he was 6, he was skeptical seeing that we didn't even live there. I was freaked out, y'all. The idea of what might have happened scared the hell out of me, but once I saw that there was no one around for me to blame, that fear turned to frustration and then straight up anger. I think if James had pointed someone out like that's him, I'd have straight up torched that dude, and I'd be writing this from prison or something. Not that a jury in their mother effing land would convict me of something like that, but you see my point. I told James to hand me the keyring, and then told him if anything like that ever happened again, he should yell for me, as loud as he could, and he wasn't to stop until I'd appeared to protect him. I told him he'd been very brave and he hadn't done anything wrong, and then gave him the speech on how not everyone who acts friendly wants to be friends. And then once all that was said and done and my heart rate had returned to normal, sort of, we got back on the road again. I remembered the name of the road that I was on a couple of minutes later because I looked it up later when I decided to call the cops. It was called Conowingo Road, a name I don't think I'll ever forget because I was driving down and I saw the sign saying Flying Plow Circus 1 mile ahead. I remember how the rage boiled up in me like you wouldn't believe, and I actually put my foot down thinking I'm going to give these a-holes a piece of my mind. I powered along the highway, probably dipping over the speed limit a couple of times, till I finally found the sign saying Flying Plow Circus next right. I don't know exactly what I was planning. Maybe just find where the carnies' trailers were, then curse up a storm on how they needed to keep a leash on their pedo co-workers before he gets himself shot. I wasn't dumb enough to start a fight with a whole bunch of random circus folk, and I wasn't about to let their buddy get away with what he did either. But then after making the turn and driving down this dark dirt road to where a circle of trailers were sat, I changed my mind completely. If I could describe that collection of trailers in 2 words, those 2 words would be horror and movie. And there was a fire in the middle of them and a bunch of people gathered around it. And then when they saw my car, I saw a couple of them turn to look at me. I couldn't make much out. They were just these dark shapes with the fire in the background, but that made them even creepier looking. I realized that it might not be a case of one rogue carny, and for all I know, the whole gang might have sent that one guy out looking for a kid to snatch and bring back to them. Now I just kept on watching them, watching me for maybe half a minute more, and then after taking one look at James in the back, who by then had fallen back asleep, I thought, screw this, and then turned around and drove off. Now before James was born, if something like that happened where someone made me mad enough to hunt them down, then yeah, maybe I'd have gotten my car and been dumb enough to get my ass kicked by a dozen pissed off carnival folk. But after he was born, it was like I had this safety software installed onto my brain where everything I did sparked the thought of, how is this going to end for me? There was no point trying to defend him from something I wouldn't survive confronting, because being a parent is literally all about living to fight another day. Life's not a game anymore for me. I have to do everything I can to protect my kid, and it's just scary as hell when you try and do all the right things and still end up with some creep breaking into your car. I called the cops from my mom's place that next day after telling her all about the man, the key ring, and all the signs from the Flying Plow Circus. They called me back basically saying that they'd been stonewalled and that no one admitted to slipping out from their camp after dark, not even for a second. And that's what confirmed it for me. If they were just a bunch of innocent, good-natured carnies just making their way in the world, then I doubt that they'd have stonewalled a pair of cops who came around asking about a kitty creeper. If there was some sketchy loner on my crew and I thought that they were up to no good, and I mean really up to no good, I'd want them gone. So the fact that they all sort of said, "I don't know what you're talking about, officers," and that made me think that they were in on it and they were just covering for their boy. On the journey back from my mom's and while driving in daylight, I slowed near that turn that I'd seen the trailers on but didn't see any signs for the Flying Plow Circus. Now, I'm guessing that they moved on after the visit from the cops, and after looking it up, I don't think the whole Flying Plow thing was their regular name. Flying Plow something, I can't remember if it was a road or a lane or whatever, was the name of the place that they set up on, so wherever they went, they'd probably put up some new signs and under a new name, and then on they'd go. I don't even know if they were running an actual circus. I saw plenty of trailers, but no big top. But what I do know is that one of them went out looking for kids, and almost certainly for no good reason at all. My name's Hank. I'm a proud Texan, and I work as a bus driver taking folks all over this great state of ours. Most of those journeys take place during the day, but sometimes I like to earn a little extra pay by taking the overnight journeys, or what you might call the red eyes. I fire up that big old rig around dusk, load her up with the sleepy travelers heading either home or away, and then take off along those long, lonely highways that stretch from Houston to El Paso and every place in between. I wouldn't call it a difficult job, but as long as you can keep the wheels turning through the witching hours and dodge all those back road deer, you can almost guarantee everybody gets where they're going safe and sound by sunup. And it's not often the bus causes you problems, because if you keep her clean and well-oiled, and she'll keep you moving and happy. It's the people that complicate things, though. Not every kind of person, but a certain kind, and all the worst rides have been down to that certain kind of person. Including this one, which was probably the worst I have ever experienced. Driving the bus across Texas at night with nothing but country songs and the stars to keep me company, it sometimes makes me feel like a night watchman, one charged with guarding the whole damn state. Now, I meet all kinds of interesting people on that open road under the big Texas sky, and then watching the sun rise over the prairies after a long shift, it's pure gold, but the cons hit hard too. Your sleep schedule gets all turned around, so whenever you're working nights, you miss out double on family dinners and weekends with the kids. The fatigue creeps up on you too, and dealing with rowdy passengers or breakdowns in the middle of nowhere is no picnic. But every so often, you get a special kind of rowdy. The kind that's not just drunk and loud or complaining about fellow passengers' body odor. The kind that's dangerous. Real dangerous. Back during the fall of 2007, I was on a run from Dallas to Austin, driving through the pitch black with nothing but tumbleweeds and truck stops for miles. I had this fella riding with me about 6 rows back, one that had been staring out the window and kind of muttering to himself, at least according to a fellow passenger anyway. I couldn't hear him at first, so it must have been nothing but a few grumbles and not enough to cause a scene. But then after maybe an hour on the road, I started hearing him as he started to raise his voice. I looked up into my mirror to see folks shifting uncomfortably in their seats, but nobody said a word. That happens more often than not. People learn to tune out the oddballs on long bus rides like that, but the guy didn't get any quieter. He only got louder, and as he did, the tension in the air got thicker and thicker. My guy twisted something fierce knowing trouble was simmering, and I just prayed that it'd blow over, sort of like a false alarm, but it didn't. When it came, the guy went off like a firecracker on the 4th of July, almost like his fuse was sizzling away for a while, and then bang, off he went, and there was no stopping him. I heard someone say something to him, I guess a sort of shut up or something to that effect, and the guy replied with a full-throated roar, and then went at that challenger like a freaking skunk pig. I looked back for just a second to see him leaning across the center aisle, lunging at the person I assumed did the back-talking. I had to keep my eyes on the road, but I looked up into the mirror to see fists raining down, and then the sound of passengers screaming along with a doom, doom, doom of the big guy's fists against the other's face. They weren't fighting. It was like a beating, the kind that, if it wasn't stopped, was going to end in a casket and a family dressed in black. The bus exploded into chaos as the beating continued, with some people running for cover toward the rear and others charging the attacker to try and end the assault. And when he realized what was going on, the attacker sort of wheeled around and started swinging on the folks trying to stop him. And let me tell you, this man was no small specimen. From what I could tell, he made short work of the people trying to stop him, and I think he straight up knocked a guy out too, because something freed him up to go back to wailing on the first guy he attacked, who by then was out cold and leaking blood from his nose and mouth. I didn't get a picture of all of this until later, obviously, because I was mostly trying to keep my eyes on the road while keeping an eye on the situation behind me using my driver's mirror. But then as soon as I realized the violence wasn't about to stop anytime soon, I started slowing us down so I could pull us over and get as many people as possible off that bus. I didn't hit the brakes in a sort of screaming tires kind of way. You can't do that on the bus with people standing unless you want them falling head first. And while I didn't mind if our psycho attacker banged his head on an armrest, I had to consider the other passengers too. I brought the bus to the side of the road as fast as I could, which felt painfully slow given what was happening right behind me. And then once we'd come to a stop, I opened up the doors and began hollering for people to get out as quickly as they could. I think I herded about 12 to 14 people out of the front, and there were women clutching their children, a couple of old-timers who couldn't move as fast, but everyone else moved like greased lightning. Everyone except the people trapped on the back of the bus who were being blocked from the front exit by our raging psycho. We had an emergency exit at the back of the bus, so I started yelling at the people in the back to pull the lever and push the door open so they could all scramble out onto the road. I don't know if they just couldn't hear what I was saying over the sound of their screams, or they were too scared to turn their backs on that attacker, but they didn't do as I asked. I kept on yelling louder and louder, but then the psycho turned his attention to me and then came charging down the bus while roaring like some beast. I tried to put something between us. That something being the driver's seat, but as most of you can probably imagine, all he had to do was move a yard to the side and his fists had unfettered access to my face. I felt a couple of punches and kicks, but all I could do was try and shield my head in the hopes that he didn't do any serious damage. At one point, the guy actually grabbed one of my arms by the wrist and pulled it away so he could punch me right in the eye. All it took was one punch, and it felt like I couldn't see out of it anymore, and I knew it'd only take a couple of more of that to do some serious damage. The same pattern played out again, with people trying to get him off of me before being beaten back, and then he turned back to me and started all over again, but he didn't last long because maybe a second or two later all I heard was, "Hey, right here!" It was a young voice, almost sounded a bit like a kid's, and then bam, there was a gunshot, and then I heard that attacker start to groan. I looked around, the vision in my right eye still kind of cloudy, and I saw the attacker was curled up on the floor of the bus near the exit stairs, and he was clutching at his belly with a blood stain getting bigger and bigger on his shirt. Standing over him was this black kid with a gun, and I say kid as he must have been in his late teens, probably early 20s, but there he was, standing over the guy with a smoking pistol, telling him if he tried to get up, he'd blow his head off. With the attacker put down, and with all the fight having left him, the other passengers were able to get off the bus. People were treating the kid with the gun like he was some hero, but all he seemed interested in was getting out of there. I told him to hold his horses because the cops wouldn't arrest a man for defending people like he did, but he turned to me and, with a sort of scared look in his eye, he says, "It ain't legal. It ain't legal, man. I gotta go now." And then off he went. Lord knows where, and that's honestly the last I saw of him. With folks huddled outside in the cold, yes, Texas nights can get cold, I called in what had just happened on my cell and then waited with the rest while they either cried, hugged each other, or just stared into space like I did, wondering how the heck things all went so bad so fast. And not long after, we all saw lights flashing red and blue across the flatlands, and then as they got closer, they were joined by sirens. State troopers rolled up first. Their guns were drawn so they could secure the scene, and then I gave them the lowdown on that berserker. I mentioned the shooter too, and I know I should have been honest with them, and I might have been a little selective over what I remembered because God knows I didn't want that kid's good deed treated like a bad one. Once the cops had the scene secure, the EMTs came right behind them. They hauled off that unconscious fellow with his face all busted up and then stretchered off that young woman too, the one the attacker had given a few hard licks. And they even checked the attacker too, who was still alive but in a lot of pain, and then with him handcuffed to a stretcher, they took him away with a cop sitting in the back of the ambulance with him. The cops questioned everybody, taking statements while I stood there feeling like I'd aged a decade in about an hour. And the company I worked for got a replacement bus out to us as quickly as they could, and then once the dust settled and the authorities cleared us to go, we were back on the road again. We were minus a couple of passengers because some had chosen to wait for kin or friends so they could ride with them instead, but we were also plus one because I got to sit back and enjoy the ride with the new driver at the wheel. The atmosphere on the bus now was pretty dark, with folks whispering to each other about what had just happened. But I preferred the talk because, when it came, the silence was honestly heavier than a lead blanket. I still think about that kid sometimes, the one who shot our attacker before he could do any serious damage to me. I guess if you told me about a guy like that walking around with an illegal gun, I'd have assumed that he was the bad guy. And I guess he sort of was one of the bad guys if he was a felon or what have you. But then all it took was one pull of the trigger at that right moment, and he became kind of a hero to me. I know there's no such thing as a perfect person, but since that night, I've never been so convinced of the existence of flawed heroes. So I used to drive taxis in Liverpool back in the 80s. Now, it was great money for what it was, and so even though I only planned on doing it long enough to find a replacement for the job I'd lost, I ended up driving for almost 3 years before I finally gave up. A big appeal was that I could work when I wanted. If I had something that I needed doing in the daytime, be it something with the kids' school or whatever, I could just take a few hours off, take care of business, and then head out on the jobs again at night to make up the hours. And there was no doing that in a factory or down on the docks, not without getting your pay docked anyway. But it wasn't all sunshine and roses, and I remember one particular job where for a minute or two, it didn't look like I was going to make it home to my family that night. It started when a job came through just after 10 p.m., asking me to take someone from Agberth Vale to Anfield. I got the address, drove over, and then parked up outside a small 2-up, 2-down on a dark and quiet street. I didn't want to beat my horn, which was the usual method of letting a customer know that we were outside, so I gave dispatch a buzz on my radio and asked them to call the customer back to let them know that I was waiting. Dispatch said no one picked up the phone, but then maybe a second or two later, I saw someone walking out of a house and towards my car. Now, as I said, it was dark, so even though I saw the shape of them moving towards the back passenger door, I didn't get a good look at them until they were sitting behind me, and when I did, I almost pissed my kecks. He was wearing a balaclava, and after he shut the door, he sank down low in the seat to make it harder for him to be seen from the outside. Now, he had what looked like a jerry can of petrol in one gloved hand, and then with the other, he pulled out what looked like an old detective gun from his jacket, like a proper six-shooter, and pointed it directly at me. He said if I tried to run, I'd be shot. In fact, if I did anything that even remotely upset him, I was a dead man. Now, my only job was to do what he said, and when he said it, and if I did, I'd go home alive that night. And so, seeing as I didn't have much of a choice, I drove where he told me to go. We ended up parked up across from a pub not far from the Rialto on Upper Parliament Street, I remember, and the lad in the back told me to turn off the engine and then spent the next 15 minutes or so checking his watch and peering up over the solid part of the door to watch the pub through the window. He kept on checking his watch, and I kept getting the urge to try and talk him out of whatever he was about to do. But every time the words were about to come out, something stopped them. I stayed quiet, and then noticed that when the clock on my dash hit 11 p.m., the lad in the back started getting even twitchier. When I noticed people coming out of the pub, obviously around kick-out time, the lad told me to start the engine. He was watching the pub doors like a hawk, and then suddenly, he started rolling down the window all frantically before he pointed the gun out the window, shouted something I couldn't make out, and pulled the trigger. One of the fellas who just walked out of the pub hit the concrete like a wet sack of spuds. Someone screamed, and then the guy in the back seat let out a scream of his own as he told me to drive. I obviously had to stay under the speed limit where possible, but it was tough with a gun pressed in the back of my head every so often, with its owner telling me that if I stopped for the police or took us down any dead ends, I'd be getting one to the back of the dome. The lad directed me to drive all the way out towards Speke to some of the derelict land near where the airport is today. He told me to get out of the car and then started emptying that can of petrol all over the seats after joining me outside. And that was the closest I had got to trying to do something when I realized that I was about to lose my car. I know that probably sounds horrible, seeing as I didn't do anything about him shooting that fella outside the pub, but I wasn't really in any position to do anything back then, whereas watching him pour that gasoline with his back to me, I knew that there was a very slim chance that I'd be able to get the drop on him. But if I didn't, I was a dead man. And so I basically talked myself out of it in my head and then watched as he set my car on fire and then ran off into the darkness. I just remember feeling numb. Less than an hour before, I hadn't even received the job yet, and then just a short while after parking outside that house to pick them up, my life had been changed forever. We obviously didn't have any phones back then, so I couldn't just call the police with a mobile like I would now. I had to walk all the way to a payphone, which took quite a while before I could contact the police, and only then could I give them any details. All I wanted to do was go home, get in the bath, and crack open one of the beers that I had waiting for me in the fridge. But the police wanted me to wait where I was so I could guide them to where my car had been dumped. It honestly didn't take all that long, and I'm grateful the police got out to me so fast, but the last thing in the world I wanted to do was go back to where my car was still smoldering and repeat my story for a second time. But I had to, because the most important thing was making it really bloody clear that my part in the murder was an unwilling one, and I did that by giving them as much info as possible on the man that had done the shooting. But when they asked if I'd be willing to appear in a court at a later date, I told them no. Call me a coward, but to me, you'd have to be mental to testify against some gangster in this city. Maybe if I was in London or New York or somewhere like that, but not Liverpool, because everyone knows everyone around here. And they said that I might get asked again if murder detectives were put on the case and they found someone they wanted to charge. But the fact that I never got that call is the only proof that I need that they didn't catch anyone. I used to have nightmares about it too, proper horrible ones as well. But nowadays I just have these dreams. Not quite nightmares, but still clear enough for me to remember when I wake up in the morning. And sometimes in those dreams I do what I wanted to do in the moment and beg the killer to reconsider. But no matter what I say and no matter how I say it, he never, ever listens. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your own story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, the beacons are lit. Gondor calls for aids. Just over 2 years ago now, I got a call from an old friend's wife. I thought it'd be her and my old friend Luke passing on some belated Christmas wishes, as I hadn't seen either of them over the festive period. It marked the first time in almost 20 years that I hadn't seen him during that time, but for that, there was a very reasonable explanation. The week before Christmas, Luke's mom had suddenly passed away. He and his family were devastated, so instead of doing the usual and spending every spare moment down at the pub, he very understandably wanted to have a quiet Christmas. The funeral had been small, a family affair, and so when the name of Luke's wife popped up on my phone, I was excited to hear from her and my old friend. But as it turned out, Luke wasn't there, and in fact, he'd gone missing. Sarah said it wasn't so much Luke's absence that worried her. It was what he'd said before he left. He was still grieving, so the idea of him needing some time alone was understandable, but when Sarah said he mentioned something about talking to an angel, my jaw dropped. Sarah asked where he was going and why, and Luke only told her, "You wouldn't understand," or "You wouldn't believe me." Sarah then said she wouldn't let him leave until he told her where he was going, and when Luke replied, "To talk to an angel," she was too stunned to stop him as he shoved his way past her with a bag full of supplies and some spare clothes. When she asked if I knew what that meant, I said yes, that I did, and that while I couldn't promise anything, I had a pretty good idea where I could find him, and not only would I tell her where that was, I'd do one better. I'd drive all the way up to Scotland, and I'd bring Luke home myself. Sarah was worried Luke had gone insane, and while I didn't know if that was the case, I knew that if we got the police involved, Luke might end up getting into some serious trouble. Now, we didn't want him locked in a cell or doing 30 days in a mental health unit if all he needed was just a nice hug. And if he needed serious treatment, then sure, we could go down that road if we needed to. But both me and Sarah agreed that the best thing to do was to find him before he got himself into trouble. And not just the legal kind either, more like trouble from the weather. Sarah noticed how Luke was packing some camping gear into his car before he left. Another thing which frightened her because where was he planning on camping in the middle of bloody winter? She had no idea, but I did. Like I said, Scotland. More than 20 years before, when myself, Luke, and two friends of ours were all either 21 and 22, we went on a camping trip to Ayrshire. We drove out to a place called Loch Braden, set up a campsite near the loch's edge, and then spent a few days roasting chestnuts on an open fire, getting pissed drunk and hoping it would snow. And yes, you heard that right. We didn't head out camping in the summertime like normal people. We went 2 days after Christmas because we felt cheated out of a white one and fancied an excuse to booze it up around a warm, crackling fire. Now, I know that probably sounds mental to some people who would rightly assume winter camping to be a pretty terrible idea, but we were young, dumb, and full of such terrible ideas. And so off we went. It didn't snow while we were there, but we did find a chestnut tree, and now the taste forever reminds me of freezing my balls off up in Scotland. It was worth it for the fire and booze and the banter, though, and it wasn't just beer and vodka keeping our own fires burning, if you know what I mean. We were passing spliffs back and forth, but not Luke. Luke didn't do anything like that, so nothing but alcohol passed his lips. Or at least, it seemed that way, right up until the point he just sort of walked off. Now, me and our two friends were absolutely bombed, so while we were splitting our sides over absolute nonsense, Luke seemed to be on a different wavelength. I kept an eye on him to make sure that he was doing okay, and he didn't seem sad, but over time he got quieter and quieter until eventually he just got up and walked off on his own. We called out to him, asking where he was going, because we'd usually announce if we were going for a piss or whatever, for safety purposes, I suppose. But Luke didn't say anything, and we had to call out and ask where he was going just to be told, just going for a walk. Now, me and our two pals started poking fun at him and saying he was slinking off to take the knock, as we called it, which just means vomiting after drinking or smoking too much. Now, I thought that he'd be back in a few minutes, but I think maybe an hour flew by with us just laughing away before we realized that Luke still hadn't come back. Now, we started panicking a bit, because our mobiles were useless out there in the middle of nowhere, so off we went with our torches to go looking for Luke. Now, it got quite scary at times, and not just because we were so drunk and stoned, but because reality started to become something of an elastic concept at times. That was mostly my fault, and that admission will make a lot more sense later. But for now, let me quickly reassure you by saying that we found Luke, safe and sound, and got him back to the campsite. Now, we were all knackered by then, and so not long after getting back to camp, we got into our sleeping bags and let the campfire burn down as we got some much-needed rest. But then, as we're all lying there in our tents and there's nothing but quiet and stillness, Luke spoke up in this obviously drunken voice and said something like, "Guys, I saw an angel out there." Now, he said it so sincerely that we all just sort of burst out laughing. One of our friends, Ben, replied asking, "Bloody hell, mate, how much you had to drink?" Now, our other friend was laughing, saying, "You saw a Christmas angel, did you? My arse you did. The angel flew out of those lagers you were drinking." Now, Luke insisted he wasn't mistaken, but sounded like he was on the verge of passing out, and then once the laughter died down, we all just sort of slowly fell asleep. Now, the next day, we packed away the camping gear and agreed on a nice fried breakfast in a cafe before heading home. We poked a bit of fun at Luke over his claim that he'd seen an angel, but he took it on the chin with a very much, "Fine, you don't have to believe me" kind of attitude. Now, I assumed Luke might feel a bit embarrassed and was all too willing to move on from his little sighting, but he didn't. In fact, over the next year or so, the angel sighting seemed to be the basis for Luke's newfound faith. He didn't turn into a complete Bible thumper or anything like that, and since he didn't shove it down our throats or anything, me and his other friends were just kind of like, whatever floats your boat, pal. Some came to believe that whenever Luke talked about the angel, he was weaving a kind of metaphor about finding God up in Scotland one Christmas after having a bit too much to drink. But I knew Luke wasn't talking in metaphors. He really did think that he'd seen an angel. And so when he told his wife that he was going to talk to one, I had a pretty good idea of where he was heading. And that place was Loch Braden, the same place that we'd gone camping all those years before. I rang into work, told them I needed a few days off of work for personal reasons, and then drove up to Ayrshire first thing in the morning. I then reached Loch Braden by about 1:30 in the afternoon, and there was snow at the time, not much of it, but enough to give it that proper desolate look. And I can't say it was enjoyable though, because strong winds meant that it was absolutely freezing, and I had to bundle up against the cold before heading out in search of Luke. I didn't wander around the loch calling out his name. Instead, I was laser guided towards the place we'd camped at all those years earlier, and when I found it, there stood a dark green tent with a dead campfire and a few bits of camping equipment sitting near the entrance. I called out to Luke asking, "Are you there, mate?" But the tent was empty. I had no way of knowing if the tent was really his, not until I found the Bible he had sitting next to a rolled-up sleeping bag, and then I knew. I then spent the next hour or so wandering around the snowy woods calling out Luke's name, but when I didn't find him, I wandered back to his camp and decided to wait for him there while I got a fire going to keep warm. It was almost dark by the time I heard footsteps approaching, and at first I was a bit nervous that it wouldn't be Luke. But it was, and since I already had a feeling that he wouldn't be pleased to see me, I wasn't surprised when he wasn't. No, I said something to him like, "Hey mate," and was about to offer an explanation as to why I was there, but Luke cut me off by asking who told me where he was. Now I didn't want to get his back up by treating him like a kid. I wanted cooperation, so that's what I went with, and told him Sarah was worried about him. He didn't get angry or anything, not yet, because he knew we were just concerned about him, but Luke did let me know, and very firmly, that he wouldn't be leaving till he talked to his angel. I honestly couldn't tell if he had gone crackers or not, so I tried to test him in my own little way on little bits of info. I asked him how long he'd been there, what route he'd taken on the drive up, and what he'd said to Sarah before leaving. All his answers seemed kinda lucid, and he didn't mention any kind of wild conspiracy theories or anything delusional like that, and he didn't go off on any religious rants either. He said he didn't expect me, his wife, or anyone else to understand, but he needed to find his guardian angel because he needed to get a message to his mum. And when he said that last part, it felt almost like a punch to the gut. Or maybe that's the wrong way of describing it, but it was just such a sad but almost sort of relatable thing to want. Like I said earlier, Luke's mom had suddenly passed away, and he was understandably taking that very badly. But it wasn't a question of what he was doing being healthy or not, or if what was happening was something much more damaging. It was a question of what Luke was going to do when I told him the truth. We had a nice long chat about the camp trip that we went on, and then touched on how his mom's funeral had been. It was nice to reminisce, but seeing him grieving so deeply was very tough. But then as we continued talking over a campfire supper and the darkness fully crept in, we got talking about Luke's angel and what it may or may not have been. Again, he was weirdly reasonable about it and didn't expect anyone to understand. It was just something that he had to do so he could be at peace with his mom's passing. But then, I asked how he'd feel if I could guarantee he wouldn't find his angel again, because it was my fault he thought he'd seen one in the first place. Luke just sort of laughed, because the very idea that it was me that was responsible for him seeing his angel was laughable. But the only reason he didn't full-on belly laugh, at least in my opinion, was the look on my face when suggesting it. Because I wasn't joking. In fact, I was very serious. Because the reason Luke wandered off in a daze like he did, and the reason he believed that he saw an angel, was because I put a tiny bit of LSD in his alcohol when he went off for a piss. He was already drunk, and he was drinking some cheap piss, so he didn't pick up on the taste at first, and I thought it'd have a funnier effect on him, but I guess it didn't. And when he didn't come back when he thought he would, I felt very personally responsible. No one but me knew I brought any, and I was planning on telling him that what I'd done come bedtime or the next morning. But after we, or should I say I, almost lost Luke, I decided not to tell anyone what I'd done for fear of the backlash. And then as the years went by, I felt more and more guilty about what I'd done. So much so that when Luke's wife told me that he'd put himself in danger by camping up in Scotland in the middle of winter, I felt personally responsible. It might have only been a snort, but Luke laughed when I suggested I was responsible for his angel sighting. But when I mentioned the acid that I'd slipped into his beer, not even trace of amusement was visible in his face. He went full-on denial mode and argued that I was only saying that to get him to come home. Now, I suppose I should make it clear to anyone reading this that I wasn't just making it up, and I really did put drugs in my friend's drink. My defense at the time was that it wasn't much. Enough to get him loosey-goosey, but not full-on tripping. But that's no excuse, I know that, because that one stupid joke had altered Luke's whole reality. And although he completely refused to accept it at first, that didn't last long. I think the thing that really pushed him over the edge was when I started describing his symptoms back to him. I told him that although he was quiet, I was worried about him because I knew the dose that I'd given him would serve as a real mood enhancer. And I also knew that he'd walked away from the fire at first because it was too bright for him. First-time trips can be like that, especially if you don't know what's going on. And I added it was me who initiated the Luke's going to vomit joke, partly to try and distract from the fact that I'd dosed him. I told him whatever he'd seen out there, be it a trick of the light or a big bird of prey passing over the face of the moon, his imagination had taken hold of it and turned it into something it wasn't. I was halfway into explaining how I knew it couldn't have been some full-on hallucination because I'd given him such a low dosage when Luke just charged me. He didn't shout or scream, he just started attacking me in a complete frenzy, punching and kicking till I was on the ground and curled up in a ball shouting, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry." I did try and defend myself at first, purely on instinct, I suppose. But as you can imagine, it was a complete mismatch in terms of how angry he was versus how sorry I was. And when he stopped kicking me, Luke dropped to his knees and kind of rolled me over. I thought he was going to start punching me in the face, but instead, his hands went for my throat, and he started to strangle me. I reached up to try and claw his fingers away from my neck, and then I tried grabbing his arms at the elbows to drag them away, but neither thing worked. And it was then that I had this horrible moment of realization that this was how I was going to die. Murdered up in Scotland by one of my oldest friends because I'd revealed his entire belief system was the result of nothing more than a prank. I don't think I deserved to die for something like that, but in the moment, I had a very dark sense of, I get it. I brought this on myself. I still tried to get his hands off of me, but all that rage in him, it was like it gave him super strength or something. And I think it was only the thoughts of the consequences that made him stop. And by that I mean if he thought he could have gotten away with killing me, I'm not sure Luke would have let go. But he did. And when he did, it was like taking my very first breath of life all over again. I've never known a lungful like that, but I could feel how puffy and hot my face was from how red it had turned. And all the I'm sorries got replaced with thank yous, because it was clear he'd just spared my life. But Luke wasn't ready to let bygones be bygones, and after pacing back and forth for a minute straight, still in a rage, he told me to do one, meaning get lost. I remember wanting to ask him if he was sure we couldn't just talk it out, but I knew that'd be a waste of breath. I'd never seen him that angry before, and not that I deserved it, but I knew that there'd be no reasoning with him at this point. Luke saw me hesitating to leave and then came at me shouting to F off and making out like he was going to hit me. And so I did as he asked and left. I walked back to my car, feeling the aches from Luke's punches and kicks and the soreness in my throat, and then drove back home, and we never spoke since. I called his wife from a service station and filled her in on everything that had happened. I put off telling her about the spiking incident for as long as I could, but when I did, she did a kind of verbal double take in asking me to repeat myself, and when I did, she immediately hung up. There was no anger, no insults. She just hung up the phone, and that was the last time I spoke to her, too. I understand why they've chosen to cut me off. I just hope that one day they find it in their hearts to forgive me, and if Luke still has his faith after I told him, then I hope that'll one day be the case. Because after thinking about it for quite a while, and I think that in a way, Luke really did find his angel out there at that old Ayrshire campsite, and when it spoke to him and told him to spare my life, he listened. My name's Allison. I'm from Seattle, and while it took me way longer than I wanted to, I'm finally ready to send this over. For the longest time, I had a friend named Chris, and Chris suffered from persistent depressive disorder. It started after he lost his job, got violently mugged, and then got really sick with some kind of viral infection, all while his relationship with his fiancée was falling apart around him. He ended up moving back in with his parents up near Richmond Beach for a while, and then after finding it harder and harder to get out of bed and leave the house every day, Chris just sort of stopped trying. He was put on various cocktails of medication in the hopes one might work, but nothing did, and for a while he just rotted away indoors. But then in early spring of 2019, Chris asked if I wanted to go get sushi. He was online a lot, which was pretty much the only way we kept in touch, so hearing from him wasn't a shock. But hearing that he wanted to meet in person, that came as a real surprise. I accepted the invitation, and while he still had a whiff of hermit about him, he seemed way, way better than before. I didn't question it. I was just too happy to see progress. But at the same time, I knew that there had to be something going on in Chris's life to prompt such an improvement in him. I'd be damned if I wasn't going to figure out what it was. The day after we met for sushi, I asked Chris what had changed, like if he'd been doing or taking something new. And he said he'd found a kind of support group that met once a week, and since he started going, he'd been feeling a lot better about life. They met in a coffee shop, but they didn't sit in a circle, doing land acknowledgements and using therapy language. It was more like show up, hang out, and just talk to people for real. And that was usually a little talk at the end by the group's organizer, but that consisted of nothing more than a poem and maybe the odd announcement. It was very informal, very laid back, and for the first time in a long time, Chris found the confidence to start living his life again. Now, this was obviously great to hear, so I asked about it, and Chris said the group was called Mother's Love. It seems so crazy to me that after all the medication and all the therapy, that Chris really just needed some connection, you know? I don't take it to heart that we as friends couldn't do that for him either, because Chris needed new connections with new people as concrete evidence that he could place faith in his fellow humans again. Sometimes I'd ask him about the group, and that's how I found out that they didn't have any kind of online presence, because they didn't want a whole bunch of people turning up and killing the vibe. It was supposed to be intimate and meaningful, so it was down to attendees to exercise discretion in who they invited. I had to wait months until late December of that same year, 2019, to get anything resembling an invite. But when that invite came, it was not in the form I expected it to be. When Chris asked if I was still interested in getting involved, I told him I didn't know about involved, but I sure did want to stop by so I could check it out. And that's when he told me about the winter retreat. According to him, Mother's Love had reached a point where expansion was starting to make sense, so each current member had been instructed to pick out a +1 for a weekend of camping. And then to incentivize their attendance, the whole weekend of the retreat would be entirely free for that +1. And at first I wasn't sure, because spending 2 nights in a tent together in the freezing cold did not sound like my idea of fun. But when Chris told me it'd be more like glamping, as in like super warm tents with super fancy features, I totally had to reconsider. He said the food would be all vegan, which was awesome, and that the open bar on Saturday night would be a really fun way of making new friends while getting lit for free. Well, that about sealed it for me, and I promptly prepared myself for a weekend of winter camping. We arrived at what amounted to a luxury campground on Friday afternoon, and it was totally amazing. They had showers, a bar that served hot food, and then a kind of conference and party room. And the tents? They were more like miniature cabins. They had covered floors, a heater, separate sleeping compartments, thank God to be honest, and a little communal space with squishy log pillows to sit on. We didn't just have super cozy, faux fur-lined sleeping bags either. We were giving these heavy, memory foam sleeping mattresses as well, and they were super squishy and soft. It was definitely not what sprang to mind when I thought free camping weekend, but I also remember wondering, like, who the hell put all the money up for this? And I definitely wasn't about to question it though, so I just sort of went with it. Now once we were all settled in, one of the retreat's organizers stopped by mine and Chris's tent and asked us to attend a little conference hall for the welcoming ceremony. We found about 30 people in the conference hall before Chris started introducing me to some of the people he knew. We chatted for a while, making introductions, and finally, an older lady took to the podium and asked for our attention. She introduced herself as Mary, and then after welcoming all the newcomers to Mother's Love, she touched on some topics that we'd be discussing over the next 48 hours or so. And only then did I realize that Chris hadn't told me the whole story. I don't want to rehash everything that Mary lady said because she talked for like 45 minutes, but most of it was about the seminars, and this is the gist of it. There was one about maintaining a low impact on the environment, which was all well and good, but then there was one about anti-natalism, which turned out to be a fancy word for thinking having babies is like wrong or something. And when I asked Chris about that afterwards, he said some people believe the earth is so overpopulated that it's messing up the environment. But I thought Chris's group was just coffee and pancakes, not hardcore political stuff. And Chris said it didn't start out that way. It was just something that they all got talking about over time. But there seemed to be a dramatic difference between the seminar on centering oneself in nature and the one I think was titled The Death March of Western Capitalism. Now, I thought we were going to be drinking cocoa around a campfire and going on nature walks, but Chris just kind of shrugged it off. He said he wasn't really into the political stuff either, so we could just sit it out if I wanted to and head off on that nature walk when I was excited to. And then I asked him about something Mary had said when she was introducing herself, and his response wasn't nearly so reassuring. And so when Mary, the organizer lady, introduced herself, she said a number in the 300s and then ppm, and I'm thinking, huh? What? In my head, but she just breezed right past it without explaining. Chris said that Mary and a lot of the regulars didn't use numbers to describe their birth years. They used ppm, which, after double-checking it, definitely stands for parts per million, and then the number describes how much CO2 there was in the atmosphere during that year. And so, like when Mary said, I was born in 300 whatever ppm, she meant like the 50s or something. And I remember thinking, bro, what the heck? This is goofy as hell. Because, yeah, screw the oil companies, dude, sure, but using ppm instead of just saying your birth year, just a bunch of weirdos. But Chris didn't think it was all that funny. I mean, he smiled, but he didn't seem to think it was dumb like I did. And then I asked him if he knew what ppm he was born at. Then, without skipping a beat, he then says 352. He laughed at my reaction and said he didn't go around telling people like Mary and the others. It was just something he Googled one time out of interest and then happened to remember. And I remember feeling like I'd kind of let him down because I was definitely not going to be able to sit through a whole bunch of political seminars. But he said not to worry, that we'd just go to the ones that sounded interesting to me. And then we went over to dinner and got talking about some of the other campers. And that part was actually super fun. Like, I'm a really social butterfly, so getting to meet everyone was cool. Dinner was great too, and we had vegan Indian food and a few drinks, and then after more of that political talk from Mary, we all went back to our tents to enjoy our early night before an early start. Now, I won't bore you with everything we did that next day because it was a lot, but it was actually super chill until dinner that evening when we started to get hyped about the party with all the free booze. But before we went off to our tents again to get ready, Mary had an announcement to make. She said the next morning all the retreat's male attendees would be entitled to receive a gift, a blessing of Mother Nature in fact, and it was entirely free. Unfortunately, the same gift would not be bestowed on female attendees, but that was something that they were looking into, and anyone interested should approach an organizer with their queries. There was a lot of confused female faces, but also notice how not all the girls there looked confused. Some of them looked like they knew exactly why, and that should have been my first big clue right there. Well, heading back to the glamping tent to get ready for the party, I asked Chris what this free gift was all about. Chris said that he had to talk to me about something, but I asked if it could wait because by that point my curiosity was burning. But then Chris said it was that very same free gift he wanted to talk to me about, and so I'm thinking, okay, go on, and when he told me, I remember my jaw dropping. Because Chris told me that free gift was a vasectomy. Now, I thought he was joking, and while Chris was smiling, it wasn't in a jokey way, more like in a "this is good news" kind of way. As it turns out, I had no idea this was the case till Chris went through it with me, but a vasectomy is actually a super simple procedure. Guys only need a local anesthetic, and then a trained professional can render a dude infertile with just a single needle-thin puncture to a guy's taint. It's not a major surgery, and while a guy definitely needs to rest up and avoid serious exercise or exertion, it's not like he's going to be held up in a hospital bed for a week like a woman after her hysterectomy. And so after I told Chris, "No way, dude, they can't do surgeries out here, that's impossible," he made it clear that not only was it very possible, but he was planning on getting the snip, as he called it, that very next morning. And I'm like, this is a joke, right? But Chris wasn't kidding. He said what brought him so much hope was the idea no one else would have to suffer like he did. His parents had brought him into the world against his will, without ever considering whether he might be happy or not. And that was a mistake he wasn't going to repeat. Knowing he wouldn't be able to reproduce made him feel like he was doing something to solve the problem, even if it was just one small but significant act. Now, I'm sure a lot of heartless psychos are going to read this and say, "Chris was making a choice about his body, how dare you try and prevent that?" Well, first off, go jump in a dumpster. And while you're in there, lying among the trash where you belong, consider that I wasn't objecting to him getting a piercing or getting frosted tips or whatever. I was objecting to him getting a mother-freaking vasectomy. Oh, but what's that I hear you cry? Oh, people from the trash, you can reverse a vasectomy. That is indeed true, but then riddle me this, dumpster dude. Does the reversal involve actual knock-you-out surgery and reopening the old vasectomy scar? Well, yes, it does. And is the surgery always successful? No, it's not. And while I didn't know that till I Googled it in a panic, I sure as heck showed it to Chris when I did. And if he didn't want to have kids, he could put a damned hood on it, or the 100 other not-safe-for-work things people do to make sure their humps don't mean bumps, as they say. But no, Chris had made his mind up. He wanted his little sacred rights so he could respect his mother's love, and there was nothing I could do to convince him otherwise. But on that, he was wrong. Rather than go into the whole drama of what happened when we were drunk, I'll just cut to the important part. We got plastered on all that free alcohol, and while I tried my very best to drop the whole vasectomy objection and just enjoy our time together, that obviously proved impossible. I got fixated on the idea the root of his motivation was destructive, not constructive, and that maybe he wasn't as mentally well as he thought he was. When we went somewhere quiet to talk, I told him how he had zero clue what was going to happen in the future, and how he might well live to regret his decision, especially if reversing the process failed and he was made infertile for good. Now he's drunk and says, "What's the point? What woman would ever want to have kids with me?" And so I told him lots of women would, maybe even myself, because, like I said, you never know how the future's going to unfold. Now, we didn't immediately start making out like in the movie or anything, but I thought I actually got through to him after saying how once he was done putting himself together and had a job and took care of himself, then he was attracted enough that plenty of girls would want to date him. And after that, we hugged it out, and he thanked me for not just being his plus one, but being a good friend and giving him hope. Now, I'll admit, that made me tear up and cry a little, but I was also super smashed, so there was that. We went back to the party, had a couple of more drinks to lift our spirits again, and then we went back to our tent and went to sleep, in our own separate sleeping compartments. Now, my memory of those last couple of hours is kind of hazy, I'll be honest, but what I do remember is going to sleep with the knowledge that one of my best friends was not about to do something potentially irreversible. But when I woke up the next morning, Chris wasn't in the tent. I put on a bunch of warm clothes and went looking for him, but was so hungover that I only got a few steps out of our glamping tent before I ran into a tree and started puking while leaning against it. Now after that, and once I sort of cleaned myself up, I went looking for Chris, but found the atmosphere in the camp to be way different than before. During the previous 2 days, whenever we went anywhere, everyone was saying, "Hey, how's it going?" to us, and were generally super friendly. But when I walked around the camp that morning, everyone just sort of stared at me, in total silence. I mean, they whispered and talked among themselves as I passed, but they wouldn't say anything to me, and they wouldn't return my fake, panicking but pretending to be friendly smiles. Now, I kept asking, "Has anyone seen Chris?" But no one would answer me, and it took until I found one of the organizers before I got any kind of explanation. The conference room was being used as the surgery, and I could already see a couple of guys sitting in the little waiting area through a large window, but I couldn't see Chris. And that's when I was approached by that same girl who welcomed us on the first day and was asked to return to our tent so we could talk in private. On the way, I kept asking, "Did Chris get a vasectomy?" But she wouldn't tell me. Not until we got back to our tent when she confirmed it. Chris has gotten up that morning bright and early, and not only did he get the snip, but he was literally the first guy to get it done. He was actually resting in another tent as we spoke and was kept separate from me because of what a, quote, negative person I was being. Now, she was the first one who told me what a terrible person I was for not just being like, "Yeah, cool, no big deal, bud." And I said the same thing to her as I'd said to anyone else. "Go F yourself with a cactus, you psychos." Chris was a vulnerable, emotionally damaged person who needed serious psychiatric care. And then as his new friends, instead of encouraging him to get it, they tricked him into a physical solution to what was a mental problem. And personally, I'll never stop hating them for that. I'll also never stop hating them for how they let people treat me as I was leaving. I cannot overstate how sickening it was to attend a seminar on feminism in Trump's America one day, and then the next, have women just standing back and smiling as grown-ass men got up in my face and screamed the C word at me so furiously that I remember their spittle landing on my cheek. I actually thought that they were going to beat me up by the time they started shoving me and throwing rocks. They didn't give a crap that I was Chris's ride either. They said that they'd find a real friend to drive him home and I should get the hell out of there while I still could. I was shaking by the time I got to my car with my stuff, and I was in tears by the time I had the keys in the ignition. I felt like I'd enabled one of my oldest friends to do something awful to himself, and then by the time I realized what was even happening, it was too late and I'd done too little to stop it. Chris and I haven't spoken since. I've tried to reach out, but he doesn't want to now. I don't even care if he got a vasectomy anymore. I mean, it's his body, his choice, right? But I just wish he'd stop punishing me for trying to play the devil's advocate and convince him that a permanent solution to a temporary problem might not have been the way to go, and that weird cult that he joined is very, very weird. So Chris, if you're out there, call me. I miss you. My name is Alf. I'm a fan from Sweden, and today I would like to tell you my very own true scary story about the most frightening experience of my whole life. I joined the army when I was 18 and I loved being a soldier. But when I was 23, I was diagnosed with a rare medical disorder and had to be discharged. I was devastated, and while I eventually adjusted to a new routine, I still missed being in the field very much. I ended up asking a couple of my old school friends if they'd like to go camping sometime, and while most thought that that was a great idea, they didn't so much enjoy the specifics of my idea. For obvious reasons, most camping here takes place in the summertime, but I didn't want to go in the summertime. I wanted to go in the freezing Swedish winter. Most people thought that I was crazy, and were saying, "Oh, thanks, friend, I'm out." Others said that they'd consider it and then dropped out one by one as the days ticked down to D-Day. In the end, the only person left who was dead set on joining me was an old friend of ours who'd moved to a different city, a friend named Varg. Varg wasn't really named Varg, it was his nickname he gave himself, meaning wolf, which should give you an instant idea of what he was like as a person. And well, despite it, I can safely tell you that he was even worse than you might imagine. If we hadn't been such close friends for so long, there's no way that I'd have tolerated behavior like Varg's. And honestly, I think him moving to Bergen for a girl that he met online actually saved our friendship, and he wasn't around to act like a jackwad anymore. He would drink and drive, get into big fights with his girlfriend, and post all about it on Facebook, and he was constantly getting fired from menial jobs for doing the stupidest things, like drinking openly on the job or sleeping on shift and then getting angry when his colleagues woke him up. And like I said, I definitely wouldn't have been friends with him had I met him yesterday, but for the most part, we actually got along quite well. We had a similar sense of humor, we both enjoyed the same sort of movies and music, and we both had a big passion for outdoor survival scenarios. And that's how I ended up thinking that just me and Varg, a winter camping trip, might actually be a good time. But one of the real pros of camping in the winter was the lack of bears, which usually hibernate between late autumn and the very late spring. Now, I still insisted that we hang some bear bait somewhere away from the camp, but it didn't help, and even though we went camping in late February, we were unfortunate enough to be found by a bear who'd woken up too early and was desperate to find food. We woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of a huge brown bear sniffing around our camp, having eaten the bait and went looking for more. We rushed out of the tent, yelling and screaming at it in the darkness to scare it away. It appeared to work at first and the bear backed off, but then it sort of false charged and tricked me into stumbling backwards so awkwardly I actually sprained my ankle pretty badly. Thankfully, it was just a false charge, otherwise I'd have been in very serious trouble. But even though we managed to scare it off for good using the bear mace that we carried with us, we were almost out of food and my ankle was in a very sorry state. I took some painkillers and then we tried to fix up our campsite a little and salvage our food before heading back to our tent. We slept until dawn, not very well I should add, and then once it was light, Varg volunteered to find a shop somewhere so he could bring back food and some stronger painkillers. I thought that was very cool of him, like just the sort of behavior that kept me friends with him, and Varg can be a pain in the ass sometimes, but you could really rely on him when you really needed to. I stayed in the tent with my ankle raised and the bear mace at the ready, and then maybe 2.5 hours later, Varg reappeared with his pack full of stuff. Now, I thought that he'd have more than some bread, bacon, and my painkillers, but when he emptied the bag inside our tent, he had all kinds of stuff with him. He had a few bottles of vodka, a whole carton of cigarettes, dozens of bars of chocolate, and a lot of elk jerky, or what we call renja snacks. Varg also had a ton of medication with him too, but not just painkillers. There were all kinds of things, from anti-allergy medicine to antacids for stomach trouble, and while I expected Varg to be pleased with himself at having brought back such a bounty, he seemed almost angry. He emptied out the bag with some force, like he was full of spite, and when I saw that strange variety of medicine tumble out onto the ground, I started to get kind of suspicious. I asked Varg where he'd gotten all that stuff, and he just said, "I found a shop." But then when I asked him why he bought and me anti-allergy medication, he snapped a little and said he just grabbed whatever he could because he needed to be fast. It made sense in a way. Varg wasn't a rich man and he wasn't generous or careless with his money, and so after a moment of thought I turned to him and asked, "Did you steal these things?" Now I knew the answer before he even said anything. He had that guilty look about him that I knew all too well, and in the past I sometimes found it funny, because you could always read his face when he'd be the one to do something wrong, like hide the teacher's chalk or put a pin on another people's chair. But that time, I didn't find it funny, and neither did Varg. He still had that angry air about him as he told me, "I didn't have enough money." And I found this outrageous, as any normal person would only buy what they could afford. But at any objection, Varg tried to defend himself by explaining what had happened. He said at first, all he did was put down the painkillers, the vodka, and the cigarettes, but he was short by just a couple of krona, our dollars here. And the lady tells him he needs more money, but Varg insisted it was an emergency and she needed to accept the amount he had. Obviously, the lady saw no emergency, just a man trying to buy vodka at like 8 in the morning, and so she told him no. Varg said he offered to come back later with the rest of the money, but sensing he probably wouldn't, the woman said no once again. And this is when Varg lost his mind. He attacked the lady, beat her till she wasn't moving anymore, and then filled his pack with anything he could grab before running out of the shop. He didn't even get help from me, he just ran before someone came along to see what he'd done. I was furious, but so was he, and if you can believe it, we argued back and forth about who was in the right. Varg insisted he did the right thing for me and him, and that was all that mattered. And to this day, I still can't believe he saw things that way. And don't get me wrong, I appreciate his instinct to take care of an injured friend, but what he did to that woman was unforgivable. and we argued about it for quite a while until finally he announced that he was getting drunk. Varg couldn't go back to the little country shop that he'd found, the only one for miles around. He'd have to walk for miles and miles to some other place to get help. And the cold had completely killed our little flip phones, so we needed a landline, and then since we were way out in the middle of nowhere, Varg would have to search long and hard to find one he could use. So before that, he was going to get drunk. Now, if you imagine Varg planned on getting drunk and then getting back behind the wheel of my car, then yes, that's exactly what he's planning on doing, and this sparked another argument between us. But since it truly was a case of beggars not being able to be choosers, I had to shut my mouth, drink a little vodka to help the painkillers along, and wait until he was good and ready to help me. And there came a point when there was nothing but silence. I didn't have anything to say to him, and he didn't have anything to say to me. And then as we sat there, me eating and him smoking, I noticed a little plane flying in the sky above our heads. I didn't think much of it at first. Who would? It was just a small plane, but then minutes later, I saw it fly over us again before it started circling us. Now, for the sake of nothing but my own amusement, I started waving at it with both arms as if to say, SOS, help us. I hoped it might fly straight and dip its wings or something, like a sign that it had seen us, but not a minute later, it flew away again without any kind of signal or indication. Varg kept on drinking and smoking for maybe 10 to 15 minutes, then finally stood up on very wobbly legs and said, "Okay, time to go." I remember groaning, not in pain, but at the thought of him being pulled over, or worse, driving my car off the road and getting himself hurt. But as I looked up at him, I saw someone behind him walking towards us through the snowy trees, and he had what looked like a shotgun in his hands. Varg must have seen my expression because he turned around to check out what I was seeing, and then when he did, he yelled "run," and then started sprinting away as fast as he could. I saw the man stop and aim at us, so I tried my best to also run as I heard a single shot boom around the landscape. As per my army training, I instinctively threw myself to the ground, and then I remembered letting out a scream of pain as I felt it shoot through my ankle. I got up and tried to run again, but fell down again. I then tried crawling, but knew that I wasn't moving fast enough, and so I did the only thing I could think of and rolled onto my back to face the man approaching us and begged for my life. I knew who it was, or at least I knew why he was shooting at us. It had to be the husband or brother or son of the woman Varg had hurt, and I was right. It was her husband. He had the shotgun pointed right at me as I explained it wasn't me, that it was my friend and that I had nothing to do with it. I think the man knew this and recognized the fleeing Varg from the description he'd been given because he loaded his shotgun and fired a second time. He missed Varg completely, but I didn't know this at the time. And so in my mind, and because there was no screaming, Varg was stone dead, and I was next. I begged him over and over not to shoot me as he loaded a third shell into his shotgun, and then for just a moment, he pointed the barrel right at my face. I thought it was all over for me. I thought I was a dead man. But after I started to pray, something I hadn't done since I was a child, the man lowered the gun and then offered me a hand to help me to my feet. All I could say was, thank you, again and again. It was no platitude either, but rather it stemmed from the deepest sense of gratitude I've ever felt. The man then told me his name was Oscar, and that if I wanted to leave those woods alive, I was going to help the police find the man who had beaten his wife half to death. I told him that sounded like a good deal, and then he helped me back to his 4x4, and we drove over to his store to meet his wife, who was being treated by paramedics, and more importantly, the policeman waiting for me. I was only too happy to talk to them, partly to clear my name and partly to fulfill my promise to Oscar. I wanted to do the right thing, but I also firmly believed that if I didn't, he would find me and kill me. Varg ended up going to prison for 6 years for what he did, but I heard they let him out in 4. We haven't spoken since, and to be honest, I consider it good riddance. But there is a part of me that wonders if someday he may pay me a visit to ask why I was so willing to talk to the police about him. And without pointing too fine a point on it, if he does, he won't get to escape like he did from that woman's husband. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember to always jack your wad. I started a new high school in junior year. I was an army brat and I moved around a lot. Unlike a lot of kids who had this kind of upbringing, I'm going to break the mold. I loved it. Spend a year or so hanging out with people, make friends who I could keep in touch with, and then move on to something new and exciting. Genuinely wouldn't have changed my child and teenagehood for anything. My new school was no different. I won't name the school or the state or anything like that, even though it was about 2016. Just cautious, I guess. Some of your viewers seem like they're pretty weird folks, not trying to be rude, but I hang out in those live streams sometimes. I'm just kidding. I love all of you. Now anyway, I'm the kind of sad bastard who's into English and writing and aspires to be a journalist or maybe even a novelist. I know, but hey, I have a finished novel. Nowhere close to publishable quality and a work in progress, so at least I'm doing something with my life. But back then, I spent a lot of time writing in the library. Not ashamed to admit that I wrote a bunch of smutty fanfic. Now this isn't relevant to the story, I promise you. You're just not going to have to read about Markiplier having an affair with Justin McElroy, and yes, I did write one about that. The point is, I'd often get engrossed in my dumb smut writing and wouldn't really notice who was around me. And that's why I'm not sure exactly when Andrew started hanging out in the library, sitting a few tables away from me, pretending to read a middle-grade book, but clearly watching me. Now let me tell you about Andrew. Andrew was sort of special needs. He was autistic to some degree, on the spectrum anyway, and he was kind of mathematical and actually a science whiz. Academically very smart, but he liked reading middle-grade books, and he could not, for the life of him, communicate with his peers very properly. Now, it didn't help that he was hard of hearing, and so he sort of talked with this sort of awkward voice that unfortunately made him sound special. And there were a couple of ASL students at the school, and apparently he could hold the deepest, most intellectual conversations via ASL on the extremely rare time that he could bring himself to engage with someone else. Now, Andrew had taken to watching me. I saw him all over the place. Pretty much everyone I spoke to admitted that this was pretty odd, so don't get me wrong. You'd assume Andrew would be the prime target for bullying, right? Well, wrong. If one of the jocks saw a guy so much as give Andrew a hard time, that guy would regret it. Everyone loved him. He may have been almost incommunicado, but he was sort of like, I don't know, everyone wanted to look out for the kid. And I mean everyone. And so I was careful who I mentioned Andrew's stalking to. I had a handful of friends that I'd made there, and I did bring it up to them. And at first they sort of said, you have to be mistaken. Andrew isn't like that. He's a gentle giant. Now I should mention he was nearly 7 feet tall. I'm not kidding. But then I pointed him out, and the way he'd watch me from corners or just openly, and they couldn't deny it. Andrew was, for want of a better word, stalking me. And the first afternoon he followed me home, I knew that I had to do something. But what? I didn't want to turn people on this otherwise harmless special needs student, and all he was really doing is watching me. It wasn't like with lust. You know how you can just tell when someone's lusting after you? It wasn't like that. It was like he was sort of fascinated with me, or that's what it seemed like at first. Maybe this will seem stupid, but I decided to do a bit of stalking my own. I stalked Andrew stalking me, stalkception, and I watched him watching me, and I kept a note of his behavior. One of my friends helped me too, and we came to an extremely odd conclusion. He wasn't stalking me or watching me. He was making sure that he stayed near me. In some ways, this made me feel a little bit better, but it also made me feel more confused. I could not for the life of me work out what his motive was, and I was beginning to feel more and more alone. And then things started getting creepy. I started spotting movement in my yard late at night. My parents both worked for the military, and while we didn't live on base, they often worked late. And my brother was a little 12-year-old brat who was more of an expert at video games than possibly protecting me, though I love my brother, so he really in that moment wasn't going to be much use. But there was someone clearly lurking out there, and the motion detector light would constantly get triggered. Then I found the scraping on my car that looked like someone had tried to break the lock open late at night. Next, there was a note slipped into my locker. I don't want to recount exactly what it said, but it described what someone wanted to do to me. And let's just say it was more Patrick Bateman than Patrick Swayze. It was written in beautiful, exquisite cursive, and this confused me even more. Andrew might have been a savant at many subjects, but penmanship was not one of them. I'd seen his essay work. The handwriting was like a middle schooler. Surely he hadn't somehow persuaded another person to write this disgusting note to me, and meanwhile, he just kept watching me, and he was always just sort of there. And then one day, he wasn't. And I found out through the grapevine that Andrew had an appointment of some kind of neurological clinic and would be gone for a few days. And of course, in that moment, I felt some relief. Well, the fool I was. That evening, I found another note in my locker, even worse than the first, and it actually had blood smeared on it. That night, I was alone overnight. It was a Friday. Someone was in my yard, and they were making a racket, and I could see this black-clad figure, definitely not Andrew, pulling up plants and weirdly spraying the hose around. Obviously, I called the cops. I even yelled out the window that I called the cops, and the guy didn't leave until almost an hour later when the sound of sirens actually blared off in the distance. Now, I was more confused than ever. There was no doubt that Andrew was stalking me, but then so was someone else. Were they in on it together? It all just seemed so unlikely. And it all came to a head when I was walking home one day. It was sunny, a warm day, so I decided to skip the bus. Who followed behind me, ducking behind walls and hedges? Andrew. Now this wasn't normal, and I was sick of it, and I had to say something, so obviously I turned to confront him. And that's when Andrew charged. Almost 7 feet of muscle barreling towards me from a few hundred feet away, and I was frozen on the spot. And then Andrew veered to the right, and with a scream, he dived into an overgrown hedge on the verge of the park that we were walking past. Out he came, flying with that black-clad figure in his grasp. Andrew slammed this person down and began shaking him back and forward, bouncing his head off the grass, and he was shouting something, but it was hard to tell what in the chaos. I ran forward. I had no idea whose side I was supposed to be on in that moment, and then the black-clad figure's hood fell away, and we made eye contact. He immediately let loose this tirade of disgusting slurs aimed at me, and he seemed under the impression that I duped or hired Andrew into protecting me from him. I had no idea who he was at first, and then one of my friends came running up and yelled, "The janitor?" And the conclusion is absolutely insane. Andrew, and only Andrew, had been observant enough to notice that the janitor was paying unusual attention to me, and from what we could get out of him, he felt a sort of dark aura from it all, and he said that a voice in his head told him to protect me. And so why was that janitor behaving like this to me? So my dad's job in the military is specifically military police. The janitor had been a private about 15 years back, and Dad had been the one responsible for catching him in the middle of assaulting a female officer, and he ensured that he spent time in military jail and was dishonorably discharged. So, when we moved that time, the janitor recognized my dad around town, researched him, discovered he'd had kids, and discovered that I went to the high school that he worked at, and decided to terrorize me. I don't know what kind of voice Andrew heard to protect me. I don't know if I believe in that type of thing, but I do know that I think it saved my life. Maybe he didn't go about it in the best way, but he went about it the only way that he really knew how. And it later turned out that the janitor had even been threatening him, promised to hurt him if he didn't stop watching me, and even that didn't put Andrew off. I did my best to befriend him after that. He wasn't exactly the kind of guy that you could become best of friends with, but I think he knew how grateful I was for what he had done, and I didn't stay at that school for much longer, as Dad's job supposedly called him away, but I think he requested a transfer at that point. I still stay in touch with Andrew via email. We sometimes play chess online, and he kicks my butt every time. We don't really have conversations as such, and it's a weird, strange relationship, really. But he's the guy who saved my life from a pretty dangerous stalker, I think, who, for all I know, would have taken things as far as killing me. So frankly, I'm happy to lose as many chess games to Andrew as he wants. I'm a high school teacher, world history, and I have been for coming up on 25 years now. I sport a buzz cut, I rock a cardigan, and I'm kinda squishy around the middle. And while my wife says it makes me lovable, I make sure that I'm hardly much to look at when it comes to younger people I work with. Now, I don't say the following to brag though, not at all. If anything, it was a curse, and it was a choice to let myself go. And when I just started out as a teacher in my mid-20s, I was, according to my girlfriend at the time, Hollywood attractive. My wife, who I didn't know at the time, look at old photos of me and say that I look like that Glenn Powell fellow everyone loves these days. Now, I guess I knew I was good looking back in those days. I had flings with more than one of my female coworkers, all single, I'll let you know. And when I wasn't sleeping with a young art teacher or the drama one, I'd prowl the bars for one-night hookups. And you could say that I was a bit of a male slut, I guess. I admit all of this because I want you to know that I want to stress as hard as I can that as soon as I entered the classroom, I became a different person. I wanted to be approachable to the students, sure, but my mentor drummed it into me from day one that I could not become their friend, that I had to inspire them, but I could not take them under my wing, and this was in the very early 2000s too, so imagine how much worse it is now. I knew he wasn't screwing with me. Another teacher at the school I started at had left under a cloud. Supposedly he was having an affair with a male student, and he vehemently denied it. Who knew the truth? But I swore to myself that I would never even wind up in a position where I could be under that suspicion. I liked my women mature enough to hold a conversation with me, to be on my level, and most important, goddamn legal. And the idea of being involved with a student sickens me, and I have nothing but contempt for the men and women who go down that path. If it feels like I'm fixating on it, there's a reason. Obviously, despite my best efforts, I found myself in a situation that became a living hell. I'll call her Billy, although that wasn't her real name. She was a senior, had just turned 18, and she really had everything. Head cheerleader, on track to be the prom queen, and a very solid GPA, and there was no reason for her to want more from academia than she did. Except for some reason, she wanted me. Now, when you're a teacher, at least a good one, you can just tell when a student has a crush on you. It's usually harmless. The odd comment, a little lingering after class, and it's easy to put the kibosh on that. But with Billy, it was different. She had a plan, and it started off with very honest-seeming questions about her world history assignments. She'd hang around after class, something I was pretty strict about when it came to having students alone in the classroom, and at first I thought she didn't realize, but it soon became clear that she was intentionally waiting for the classroom to clear before coming to me with questions. Questions I realized that she did not need to ask, being the smart girl that she was. And very quickly, I had to set some firm boundaries. I spoke to some other members of staff and shared my concerns, and they agreed that I was right to be worried. A couple of them had their own experiences with Billy. Nothing too serious, but enough to make them uncomfortable. At the same time, I didn't want to make myself unavailable to students, and so I came up with a structure where my classroom door had to be open up at all times, and my buddy Chris, the English teacher, would conveniently drop by after Billy's world history class when his AP English class also got out. Billy soon stopped trying to get me alone when it became apparent that Chris was here to stay and we were maybe on to her. Now one day, a new member of the admin staff, who wasn't aware of the whole saga, told me that there was a student outside the teacher's lounge asking about me. Now, cup of coffee in hand, I went to see who it was. It had been a month or so since I'd really heard from Billy, so I was a bit surprised to see her standing there. Now, I was even more surprised at the somewhat revealing outfit that she was wearing. Now, I was certain that that did not meet our dress code, but I didn't want to get into all that with her, so I just asked her what was up. Billy told me she was having some trouble with class, despite her grades very much saying the opposite, and asked if she could book some private tutor sessions with me to raise her grade. Of course, I said no, maybe a little too quickly. I felt a pang of guilt and then tried to soften my words a little. I didn't have the time for private lessons. If I offered them to her, then I'd have to offer them to my entire senior class. It just wasn't possible. I did, however, offer her the number of a private tutor who she could hire for further studies, a septuagenarian lady who'd been my world history teacher and tutored occasionally as part of her retirement. And surprisingly, Billy never called the number. I guess the business card caused Billy to sort of snap because that's when I started finding the typed notes tucked under my windshield. They were typed on those old digital word processors that were popular in the 80s, the follow-up from typewriters, and exactly the kind of technology that a rich family such as Billy's might actually own. Now, this didn't prove anything, of course, but the increasingly weird love letter content did, and I openly ignored them entirely but made sure to file everyone with the principal. And by now, the entire staff was sure that Billy was the culprit, but A, we had no evidence, and B, we didn't want to accuse an innocent girl, and C, Billy's father was somewhat of a pillar of the community, working in construction building of affordable housing, and also something of a large donor to the school. And they were a decent family, honestly, generous, charitable, and beloved. And if there was some way to handle the Billy situation without ruining her reputation, either at school or with her parents, we wanted to take it. It became harder, though, when those love letters started to become threats. What had started as descriptions of things this person wanted to do to me in a very intimate way shifted into a much more sadist method. It got to the point where myself and the principal were a few notes away from actually going to the cops. What if it wasn't Billy after all? What if it was some sick coincidence? Some woman I hadn't called back after, what I'd considered an agreed one-night stand, or a husband I hadn't been informed about. And this theory kind of fell by the wayside when I found a pair of crotchless panties tucked into a drawer in my desk. I kept my classroom locked and made sure no students could be in there alone, so how she'd gotten in was a complete mystery. And if it was Billy, she didn't want to make a secret of it. There was a crocheted letter above the lack of crotch, and the first letter of her real name, and while that didn't mean anything, part of me wondered if she somehow knew that she'd gone too far and had to take steps to ensure that I knew that it was her. She knew I wouldn't call the cops on her. Now, handing a pair of crotchless panties over to my middle-aged female principal was one of the most embarrassing moments of my entire life, even if they were in an envelope, but I still had to explain what they were and then stand there as she removed and studied them. She told me that this couldn't escalate, that she was genuinely concerned for me at this point, as I was young and good-looking, and no, the principal was not one of the colleagues that I'd hooked up with, and made me promise that no matter how guilty I might feel, if it came to it, the law needed to get involved. We were nearing the end of the semester, though, and prom and graduation and all of that, and then I'd never have to see her again, and I wondered if maybe these panties were her final hurrah. But how wrong I was. Much like many of the staff, I was a chaperone at the prom. Billy was a shoo-in to be prom queen along with her prom king boyfriend, Brad, and I kind of hoped that maybe the romantic win up on stage might change things for her, maybe help whatever was going on in her life. And Christ, looking back, I was a dumb 25-year-old and I really did not understand women or anything really, and I don't remember much about the prom. I remember some students getting rowdy and a couple of ejections for drinking on the premises, and weirdly, my biggest memory, save for the incidents, is just how much Billy Idol, the DJ, played. He was this British guy, and the majority of his repertoire was British music, and I'm not sure how well it landed with the students. But then came the announcement of prom king and queen. Of course, it was Brad and Billy. They took the stage, and Brad gave some gushing speech about how he was with the woman he loved, and he wanted to make her happy for as long as he could, and she'd always be his queen. And then Billy spoke. I'll always remember her opening gambit. She turned to Brad, smacked the crown off his head, and said, "You sicken me." And then she launched into a tirade about how he was a boy playing a man, and how he constantly wanted intimacy, and she said some extremely crude things that did not paint Brad in a good light. And my heart broke for her. But then she turned to me, and told me that I was the one that she was destined to be with. that I was a real man and we were soulmates and we were destined to be together. Some absolute joker manning the lights put a spotlight on me, and there was just complete awkward silence. What could I do? I had no choice but to tell Billy that there was no chance, that she was a child and I was an adult. And I tried to be as kind as possible. I told her that she'd find someone, but it couldn't be me. And I told her that I did not find her attractive, that she was nothing but just some kid to me. I really didn't notice how much it actually broke her. I was staring in my shoes, worried that I couldn't finish my speech if I looked up at her, and I didn't see the tears pouring down her face and all that mascara. But I did hear the slow clapping and then the laughter and erupting from the entire dance hall, all aimed at Billy, the most embarrassing, mortifying moment of her life, and I'd been the cause of it. But I didn't have time to feel guilty. I saw some movements and I saw Billy leaping down off of the stage. I saw her grab the sharp, lengthy knife that was resting near one of the prom cakes, and I saw her charge straight at me, blade raised, prom dress flying behind her, her face blackened by mascara and tears. And I did the only thing I could think to do as someone that was charging at me with a huge carving knife. I used my years of defensive martial arts training to sidestep her and send her sprawling to the ground. Only she didn't hit the ground. She hit a table behind me on which stood another prom sponge cake, and this one was untouched. The knife flew from her hand and Billy slammed straight into that cake and the table collapsing under her weight. Everyone was silent for a moment, and then the crowd erupted with even more laughter. Billy pulled herself to her feet, her prom dress ruined, cake and punch and food all over her, and she turned to me, and she stared at me, and I braced myself for the most terrifying threat of my life. And all Billy said was, "I'm sorry," and then turned around and left the school gym. Now, long story short, Billy quite obviously needed obvious psychiatric help that she'd hidden the need for. She had managed to graduate and with a high GPA, but college wasn't on the cards for her. Following the prom and her year of obsession, she spent 2 entire years in a rehabilitation institute. I expected her parents to blame me, and instead they thanked me for how I handled the situation and kept me up to date with her progress. After a year, I moved schools to a different state, and they would write me occasionally. Eventually, they let me know that Billy had been released and asked if I would be willing to receive a letter from her, and they told me they understood if the answer was no, but I decided to say yes. It was a single sheet containing a single paragraph, and I still have that letter to this day, and I can type it verbatim. It said, "Thank you. Thank you for not taking advantage of me. I'm sorry I pushed you so far, and I'm better now. I'm going to college in the fall, and I'm going to study world history, and I will make you proud, sir. Billy." I don't know what kind of life she's living now. I hope it's her best life, and I hope she recovered from whatever caused her behavior. But I know one thing. As I near retirement, Billy taught me as many lessons as I've taught all my students over the years, and I still refuse to be alone in a classroom with anyone who isn't a colleague. I don't think Alex Crowley was his real name, but that's what he went by, and that's what we called him. I didn't know him at first, not personally anyway. He was a sophomore when I was a freshman. I was a grungy skater kid in the late 90s, into Real Big Fish and Green Day and Sublime and a bit of Nirvana and Pearl Jam. I know, both. And I felt kind of like a badass poser because I was into Failure, a band most of my friends didn't even know, and even more badass, I was an American fan of Jesus and Mary Chain. I'd found Darklands and Automatic in an indie record store, and I'd fallen in love with both LPs. I was a bit of a musical snob is what I mean, despite being a 90s skater kid who could do a bit of grinding and a few ollies and landed a 180 spin about once, but mostly just made bailing videos with my buddy. We were the skaters, the losers, the punks, and we loved it. And our heroes, our absolute idols in high school, were the trenchcoat goths in the year above us. Their leader was a fellow called Alex Crowley, and he claimed to be a direct descendant of famed occultist, mountaineer, ceremonial magician, and founder of the religion of Thelema, Aleister Crowley. But of course he couldn't prove that because Aleister Crowley had so many illegitimate descendants that if you were one of them, you just knew. I suppose maybe that was true, but I'm pretty sure neither of Alex's parents were secret descendants of Aleister Crowley either, and I'm pretty sure the guy ate poop too, so I'm not sure that I'd brag about being related to him personally. Now, I remember when Alex and his crew first approached us as we were sort of skating around. They just stood there in their trench coats, staring and scowling, and there were 4 of them: Alex, Ashley, Jack, and Felicity, the only girl in the group who I had the biggest, maddest crush on and who drove me absolutely wild in her low-cut corsets and goth makeup. Now, she was actually nice too, unlike the others. Jack in particular was a thug, and I'm pretty sure he liked to hurt animals, but I won't dwell on that too much. Alex and Flick are the key players here that you'll have to remember, as well as me, Frankie, and my twin sister Kimmy, who were part of the skate crew. Now, this is how things would play out for about a week. Our group would just nonchalantly skate around on the steps outside the high school, and Alex's group, who I later found out he nicknamed the Sons of Joseph, would just stand there watching us, kind of sneering. And then one weekend, we were hanging out at the skate park when we saw the Sons of Joseph come stalking in. One of the skaters yelled insults and derogatory terms at them, and they weren't exactly seen as the cool people by the older guys. But Alex and co gave us as good as they got, and we were enamored. I was even more enamored when I saw Flick walk over to us. Was she gonna speak to me? Oh my god. Well, no. Actually, she spoke to Kimmy and told her that she was a whiz on the skateboard. And later that night, I told Kimmy how jealous I was, and she would not let me live it down. However, being a good sister, she told me that Flick had invited her to the mall tomorrow and maybe I could tag along. Hell yes, of course I would. And so Kimmy and I got there, and we didn't tell the other guys, and I was a little disappointed to discover that Alex, Jack, and Ashley were there too. Well, I didn't have to worry about Jack for long. He got into a fight with a security guard and he got thrown out of the mall, and Alex said that he was done with that prick. He was a liability and he didn't understand the ways, and maybe Kimmy and I would like to take Jack's place in the Sons of Joseph. Now, one look from Flick's bright, mascaraed eyes, and I was nodding like some puppy dog. Kimmy was a little bit more sensible and asked what the Sons of Joseph actually meant. I remember Alex tapping his nose and said that was something we'd discover in time. Sure, whatever, Kimmy said. And Alex replied saying that he'd hoped we'd brought money because we'd need whole new wardrobes to join their crew. I'm not ashamed to say that Kimmy and I came from a pretty wealthy family, and Kimmy was trusted with Dad's credit card. Not me, though. He knew that I'd wasted on probably video games, and she was pretty certain that spending the money on clothes would please our parents, so Alex, Ashley, and Flick led us to a hot topic. My outfit was a trench coat, a Misfits t-shirt, and a pair of leather pants that squeaked when I walked. Now, I wasn't so sure about this, but Alex promised me the squeaking would eventually wear off, and I thought about buying some cool boots, but they convinced me that my purple and black skater DCs looked kinda dope with the goth outfit. Kimmy, meanwhile, got dressed out by Flick, and I gotta say, it was extremely disconcerting to see my sister in fishnets, a miniskirt, and a mesh top with her bra visible beneath. In fact, I actually tried to persuade her that our parents really wouldn't approve of that. And she kinda listened and bought a second outfit that was more like a velour dress and made her look like a vampire, and I suppose that was pretty cool. Now, I could tell that Alex had eyes for Kimmy, and I wasn't sure how I felt about that. I wasn't sure how I felt about him at all, now that I'd spent an afternoon with him. He talked and talked and talked, and he talked about his connection to Aleister Crowley and thalamic magic and crap like that. Ashley brought up the Satanic Bible, and Alex laughed. I kid you not, for 5 minutes straight in the food court of KFC before declaring that Anton LaVey was a fraud who wouldn't know true Satanism if it bit him in the ass. I figured now wasn't the best time to tell them that Kimmy and I were Christians, so we just nodded along. I did do some reading about thalamic lore and the Order of Thelema and things like that over the next few months because I'm nothing if not academically curious. It amused me to discover that Alex was basically just making up crap. None of the garbage he spewed was accurate at all, and even though by then I'd already realized that he was a complete charlatan, it was nice to have something to laugh with Kimmy about. Speaking of Kimmy, Alex was constantly, relentlessly trying to get into her pants. Kimmy could hold her own and had obviously no interest in letting Alex take her virginity, but it still made me defensive. He was a creep and a weirdo, and not only that, he was always claiming to hear voices from his true father. He could never decide whether his true father was Aleister Crowley or Satan himself, and in his head I think that they were sort of interchangeable. One of the messages he mysteriously received was that Kimmy should engage in thalamic, intimate magic with him, and when she flat out refused, he said that dancing naked for him with sigils drawn on her body would be enough. Kimmy stopped hanging out with him after that. Too exhausting, she said, and she begged me to ditch them too, but at this point, I'd kind of abandoned all my other friends. But to make matters worse, I was deeply, hopelessly head over heels in love with Flick, and it wasn't unrequited either. We were a couple, but we had to keep it a secret from Alex because according to him, the sons of Joseph, male or female, must only lay with him and nobody else. Ashley had ditched the group by this time too and started hanging out with the chess club. We had a new member, and by the name of Norbert, I'm being serious, a nerdy kid whose presence I couldn't even begin to explain. And so the only way for me and Flick to be together was to pretend to tolerate Alex. Any attempt that we made to ditch him resulted in him mysteriously appearing or showing up at my house, which was even worse because I didn't want him anywhere near my sister. Things would have been fine, I think, if Alex hadn't suddenly had an influx of hormones and decided that his true father was sending him messages that we all needed to obey. Suddenly, Norbert's presence made sense. He was a member of the AV club, and Alex's dark father had instructed him to rig a video camera hidden in the vents in the female changing rooms so we could corrupt the fairer sex in the name of Satan without them even knowing. Of course, Flick and I were horrified by this, and Kimmy wanted to kill Alex as soon as I told her, but simply talking about something wasn't a crime. We needed proof that he was actually planning on doing it. He gave Norbert a list of times for the recordings. I stole a copy, and surprise, surprise, they were all times when Kimmy would be coming out of the gym or out of the pool, and this creep was basically planning to stalk my sister by filming her naked. I took Norbert to one side and Flick, and I told him in no uncertain terms that if he went ahead with his plan, we would not only ruin him and his entire high school career, but there was a good chance we'd end his life too. This dumb freshman, I was a sophomore at this point, Flick was a junior, fell for it, and I guess took it so seriously that he changed schools within the month. When it became clear to Alex that his plan to film the girls' locker room had failed, he flew into a rage. He slammed me up against the wall of the AV room, which we now had the keys to thanks to Norbert, and told me that this wasn't going to happen, and that I was going to have to be the one to film Kimmy. I'd be able to do it at home easily, and his true father, the Dark Lord, would bestow upon me untold riches. I told him where he could shove his untold riches, and if he came anywhere near us again, he'd wish he'd never been born. Finally, myself, Kimmy, and Flick were free. Flick and I were able to date openly now, and Kimmy didn't have to worry about this creep trying to, well, creep on her. Or so we thought. As one night Kimmy, Flick, and I were hanging out in Kimmy's bedroom playing 3-player GoldenEye deathmatch, and suddenly, a red light kept glaring on the screen. Initially, Kimmy jokingly blamed one of us, saying that we were trying to put her off with a laser pointer. But then the red light quickly disappeared, and we heard some scuffling and banging outside. I ran to the window to see this trench coat figure fleeing into the night. It was obviously Alex. He'd been testing to see if he could film Kimmy himself through her bedroom window. Flick had the dumbest yet funniest idea. Using our brand new color printer, we printed out a huge image of a fat man's ass and taped it on the window, and then we waited for Alex to come back that night, which we knew he would, and we heard him out there. He was hardly subtle. Kimmy yelled that she was going to take a shower, and we gave it 10 minutes, and then we pulled the blinds open, revealing the large printout of that ass. And I guess Alex had been filming because we heard this sort of strangled shriek and then the clattering of something falling to the floor, and saw that a trench-coated figure was running away again. When we went out there, the school's camcorder lay abandoned in the flower bed. We watched through the tape. It turned out he'd filmed Kimmy more than he thought. We were all watching when she snatched the videotape away from us and watched the next few minutes alone, and her face went pale. "Just underwear," she said. "But I feel sick." Kimmy didn't tell us anything else. Neither of us asked either, But a few days later, Alex was found with both of his legs broken, apparently by a baseball bat, and he claimed that he'd been jumped by a gang of black guys. When we asked Kimmy if she had planned to pursue the video any further, she just said no. I don't want to say that my sister kneecapped a goth stalker while in high school, but let's just say years later, and even though you passed away 6 years ago, I'll always be proud of you, Kimmy. My high school years took place in the mid-2000s. I'm a female, and for most of my high school career, probably until senior year, my entire friend group was made up of girls and one single guy, called Guy, who was probably the gayest fellow you could ever meet. We all had this weird thing where we decided that none of us were going to date during high school, and this completely went out of the way during senior year when, I guess, hormones just became too much, but as far as I know, most of us stuck to it. Sure, we snuck a kiss at a party here and there, and I'm not saying that we were prude little good girls, but we had this pact with each other that we were just going to focus on our studies. And that's why we were so shocked when one of our girlies, perhaps the most straight-laced, accidentally let slip that she had a mother-effing sugar daddy. We grilled our friend Samantha within an inch of her life. What had he bought you? Shoes, clothes, jewelry? She had it all to display. Was she physical with him? Of course, very much so. She was sorry that she'd broken the pact, but Mr. X might be the one, and she didn't want to let that slip through her fingers, not when he was so much older than her. Of course, that was scandalous by itself and led to another round of questioning. How old was he? Mid-40s? Was he married? And Samantha shyly admitted that yes, he was. Married with kids. Did we know this guy? Samantha said no, but her hesitation in her eyes, they said yes. It was a man in his 40s with kids that we knew. Now, we pretended to let it drop. We lied and said we were happy for her. Of course, we were all pretty disgusted that our 16-year-old friend was being taken advantage of by a 45-year-old man who was clearly lying about leaving his wife for her and keeping her sweet by giving her some fairly gaudy stuff. I don't know much about sugar daddies, but honestly, I would have expected a little more from the gifts. She said he took her out to dinner too and stayed in some nice hotels, but still. So we pretended to drop it, and instead, we all secretly spied on Samantha individually. I know it sounds awful, but I'll stand by it. We didn't want our friend being seduced by some dirty old man. And there was one guy whose name kept coming up, Mr. Kurswell, one of the science teachers. Samantha would often meet with him after class, and while we couldn't spy for too long, it was absolutely the only lead we had. So Mr. Kurswell became our target, and there was definitely something off about him. He'd sneak phone calls into hidden corners during lunch break. If he was using his laptop when class started, he'd often slam it closed and make sure that we weren't looking before he opened it again. There was something very off about this guy, and we became more and more convinced that this balding, bespectacled biology teacher was the one boinking our buddy. But the question was, what next? That's when Guy had this bright idea of trying to follow Mr. Kurswell one weekend. We had no idea where he'd go or when he'd go, but we decided to time it for a Saturday where Samantha had also refrained from hanging out and heavily claimed that she had a hot date with her mystery sugar daddy. If it was Kurswell, then boom, we were in luck. If not, maybe we'd catch sight of the real culprit. And so we all loaded into Guy's car, and apparently, as subtle as a cop tailing a suspect, we followed Samantha for nearly an hour and found ourselves in the next town over. It was one of those little towns that you kind of look down on. Jokes about the folks there being inbred and the fact that there was a weird smell. A cellophane factory explained that, and just kind of overall crappy. Not exactly the place that you'd expect a hot date with a sugar daddy. Samantha headed into this crappy mall, and we followed at a pretty long distance, and it became clear pretty quickly that she was checking out some stores. There were 4 of us without Samantha, so we decided that it didn't make sense for the entire group to tail her. We'd be spotted in an instant. And she was headed mostly into these girly stores, so despite her penchant for glitter and pink, we figured Guy should hang back. It was decided that I was the most nondescript and unnoticeable. Not sure if that was a compliment, but it worked well enough here. and so I followed Samantha into a bunch of stores, and what I saw shocked me. The gifts her sugar daddy had been bestowing on her, she was shoplifting them. I followed her into 4 stores and watched as she stole costume jewelry, lingerie, a crop top, and all sorts of crap. Not once did she get spotted by security either. I hightailed it out of there. I didn't want to get wrapped up in all of that, and I didn't want to look complicit. And so I met my friends at the agreed point, a sort of hidden area where we weren't in much danger of being spotted by Samantha. I was all ready to hit them with my revelation, but I didn't have a chance. They were the ones who hit me with the gossip. We were right. Our science teacher, Mr. Kurzweil, was here in the same mall as Samantha, and what more proof did we need? I waited until they finished chattering and then told them what I'd observed. There was no sugar daddy offering gifts. Samantha was a kleptomaniac. Presumably she'd traveled to the next town over because the local mall security were getting suspicious in our town, and so everyone was absolutely baffled. They definitely seen Kurzweil, and he definitely seemed sketchy, and at the same mall as Samantha too. Could it be possible that they were having a fling, but the gifts were stolen for our benefit to try and justify all of it? Or had we been stalking our friend for literally no reason? It didn't make any sense. Why would Kurzweil be at this mall? Now, it was over an hour outside of town, and our local mall was 1,000 times better. All we could do was head out and plan to head home, but first we decided to stop by the food court to grab some macas. And that's when we saw him. Mr. Kurzweil sat at a goddamn McDonald's 2-seater holding hands with someone who was not his wife. And it wasn't Samantha though either. Mr. Kurzweil and the man whose hand he held both turned to us. The unknown man looked puzzled. Mr. Kurzweil looked sick. He stood up and immediately began pleading for us to come over. Now, let's get this straight. If we hadn't suspected Kurzweil of being Samantha's sugar daddy, we would have gone on liking the dude. He was one of our favorite teachers, in fact. And now, he looked close to tears. The idea of him having an affair, even if it was to hide the truth of his identity, kind of made me feel sick, and the first thing I thought was, his poor wife. But then he called it over and explained everything. His wife knew. She too was of the same kind of proclivities as he was. She'd also always wanted kids, which were indeed his, and they both loved their kids very much. And they loved each other too, but in their own little way. But this whole business had begun years ago, before homosexuality was quite so acceptable, and the whole deal that they had with the kids and an unusual marriage, it had been a long-term lie that they just didn't want to have to explain to friends and family. He said that we could call his wife if we wanted. He said that he knew we were good kids, and he said that he was sure that some of us understood, looking pointedly at Guy at this point. And that's how the stalking of our best friend and our science teacher led us to helping him and his wife cover up their conventional marriage. We provided alibis and we did all sorts of things. And we also kind of cut Samantha off after we tried our best to talk her out of being a klepto. She refused and also saw no problem with the sugar daddy lie. We didn't tell her anything about Kurzweil, but we did tell her that we'd had a suspect, and she didn't seem to care about their well-being. It just made us realize that people are never who they seem to be, or who you expect them to be. And as a funny aside, Guy, who is the campiest, gayest man I've ever met, eventually realized that he was just as into women as he was into men, and now he's one of the biggest players, in a nice way, that I've ever met. Mr. Kurzweil still lives with his wife, and their kids have gone off to college now, and they're considering finally living their true lives. Their kids know the truth and have done so for many years, but ultimately, it's whatever makes them happy. All I'm glad is that our one little jaunt into stalking didn't lead to the ruination of multiple lives. But I'll tell you what, from now on, I've decided that unless it seems like someone's in danger, nothing is my business to get involved in. It was my idea to put on a horror production. We were the alternative theater kids. We begged the drama teacher to let a bunch of us do our own thing, and instead of yet another performance of West Side Story or Grease, all our bitching worked, and eventually Mrs. J relented. Now, my friend Kirsten wrote the script. It was a slasher play rife with squibs and blood and fake ghosts, and low on plot, really. Nobody was going to attend expecting to see Waiting for Godot, though. They wanted blood, guts, and one shocking scene, boobs. Now don't worry, we used prosthetics. None of us were getting our boobs out for a goddamn school play. Plus, we didn't want to get expelled, obviously. We practiced that play for God knows how many times, and at that stage we knew it off by heart. But something we'd never done is perform it at night. And that's when it would be debuting as a horror play, so, of course, we begged and pleaded with Mrs. J to let us start one final rehearsal at 8 p.m. It took some cajoling, but she relented. The grumpy, scary janitor even agreed to stay late to keep an eye on us so we didn't break his crap. Now, we were all excited. There were 8 of us in total, 6 players, the director, myself, and the lighting and sound guy. I won't list all 8 names because you'll forget them all, but the 4 important ones are me, Ayla, Victor as an actor, Judd as an actor who plays the killer, and Clyde as an actor, the tragic hero. And so we ran through the first scene where a few of the characters are playing spin the bottle in a cabin in the woods. The bottle stops 5 times, creating the shape of a pentagram, and a visual effect causes a mysterious puff of smoke to leave the bottle. Dead impressive. Of course, all the characters decide that it's the ghosts of Rancid Jack, a serial killer who stalked those woods 100 years ago. And of course it is. So the rest of the play continues with the characters getting picked off by Rancid Jack one by one, until only Vicky, the virgin final girl, and Clyde, the boyfriend, are left. After we ran through the first scene, 2 of the actors went outside for a smoke break and they never returned. It didn't matter too much, we just decided to mess around tweaking some of the practical effects. The sound guy did a bunch of improvements too, and I really think we had something special on our hands. To this day, I swear that if we'd actually got to perform this damn play, it would have gone down in our high school history, and not just because of the prosthetic bloody boobs. Now, eventually, we needed our 2 missing actors, so the other actor, Layla, went to look for them. She didn't return either, but we did hear a scream. This caused Judd and Clyde to go running out into the barely lit corridor. Me and Vicky stayed behind like the nervous girls we were, and of course Denny, the sound guy, had to stay and protect us. Now, this was his excuse anyway. Eventually, Clyde and Judd returned, looking pale and terrified. There'd been no sign of any of the missing 3, except for a bucket load of blood. Some of it was outside, and some of it was in the corridor. Now, of course, we all started freaking out. The only person in the building who wasn't accounted for was the freaky janitor, Mr. Williams. All sorts of rumors circulated about this guy. He was an ex-con, he'd spent time inside for killing a man in a bar fight, and he'd fought in Vietnam and had the highest kill count in his unit. He had a tin of Viet Cong teeth in his little basement office. One student swore blind that they'd seen it before Williams had chased him off. Now, there was no doubt in my mind, freaked out by constant horror play rehearsals and the alleged blood, that this janitor had killed our friends. Maybe he'd watched the play and it had triggered the Nam flashbacks. Who knew? Denny and Vicky and Judd volunteered to go get help, which, thinking back now, was kind of an odd group. Why 3 of them? All I knew was that this left me with Clyde, my IRL boyfriend, and I wasn't going to argue against holding up with him. Now, we hid in the sound booth and listened in horror as we heard running footsteps and screams and even pleas for help. All 3 of our friends had met grisly fates, we thought, and that just left us. We had no choice but to try and escape the building and call the cops. Clyde grabbed a heavy metal bar and we made our way into the corridors, and if there had been blood there before, it was gone now. Williams must have cleaned it up, and there was no sign of the bodies either. I was crying, begging Clyde to protect me, begging him not to let me die. And then, up ahead of us, the door to the maintenance area burst open. The janitor stood there, some pole held in his hand, and a look of fury on his face. He yelled, asking what the hell we thought we were doing. Clyde didn't even think to stop. He charged Williams with a metal pipe and cracked him in the skull, and this sent him collapsing to the ground, and then Clyde went to town hammering the guy's leg so he couldn't come after us. And between the grunts, he told me that he didn't want to kill him, that he had to face justice, but he had to make sure the guy never walked again and couldn't come after us. And by the time he was done, Williams' right leg was a bloody pulp, and the left had visible bone fractures in 3 places. Williams was trying to say something. Blood was bubbling out of his mouth, but Clyde kicked him in the side. Then the door burst open, and the rest of the cast yelled, "Surprise!" The cry died on their lips as they saw Williams lying on the floor, Clyde standing over him with a bloody dripping pipe like a madman, and the whole thing had been an idiotic, ill-fated prank. Everyone was in on it except for myself and Clyde, and Mr. Williams apparently. The prank ruined all of our lives. Despite thinking he was protecting his girlfriend from a stalker, Clyde faced charges when Williams, quite understandably, demanded that the full weight of the law come down upon him. And due to the extenuating circumstances, he only spent a couple of years in juvie, but it still ruined his life. The others had to live with the guilt of what they caused. They were all expelled, of course, and more than one of them ended up taking a dark path through life. And from what I know, at least one of them has ended their life over that guilt. As for me, I don't know that I'll ever get over it. Seeing Clyde defend me like that only to mutilate an innocent man, and even then I can't convince myself that there wasn't a serial killer trying to take us all out that night. My head is a mess. I've been in and out of institutes, and my latest therapist recommended that I blog about my teenage drama. I don't know if sending my story into Let's Read is the best, most cathartic idea. I know many of your audience will tell me I'm a terrible person and that we all deserve what we got. Maybe that's what I need to hear. Maybe I need to accept that we all jumped the gun and acted like fucking retards. I know we did. I guess I just need to self-flagellate, and I'm hoping that the Let's Read audience will finally either help me move on or help me blame myself enough to make a final decision. All I want to say is, Mr. Williams, if you happen to hear this from heaven or wherever you are right now, I'm sorry. You didn't deserve any of that, and you weren't a stalker, and I'm sorry my boyfriend crippled you. Hey, Dark Somnium. I'm a YouTuber just like you. Not quite as big, sadly. I've only got a few thousand subscribers since 2012, but I'm getting there. I got some plans for the next year that should bring me into the big time. I'd love to pick your brain for some help in getting bigger, actually, and if you got the time one day, email me at drinkthepiss@gmail.com anytime you want to chat, and would be really appreciated. Now, I'm not just emailing you trying to collaborate, though, I promise. I have a quick, scary story that I want to share with you and your lovely audience. Please subscribe to me on my channel, by the way. And so my channel is, I've kind of hit a brick wall. I hit a few thousand subscribers back in the 2010s when stupid Call of Duty videos and YouTube poops were popular, and I've never really grown since then. People don't care about goofy COD videos anymore, it seems, or baked memes, and it makes me sad. Anyway, that's not the point. The point is, I was a high schooler when I got big on YouTube. As you know, being an old man veteran, a few thousand subs was a big deal back in 2013, before the likes of my heroes like Leafy and iDubbbz, not to mention the main man Charlie and that Hassan Piker the Twitch streamer. And the way I figure it, when you factor in inflation, 3,000 subs in 2013 is about the same as 10 million now, give or take. And so, when some kids at my school discovered that I was a YouTuber with what they saw was a crazy amount of subs, I became something of a celebrity. They uncovered my double life because I made the mistake of watching my own content on the library computers, and they saw what I was up to. Oh well, I thought. I kind of expected that I'd just become a minor celebrity in sixth form, as I went to one of the UK schools that includes sixth form as part of the school itself, and yeah, I guess that happened. Now, what I didn't foresee, though, was Rick. Rick was in the year below me, so AS level, and he was a film studies student. When he discovered I was a successful YouTuber, he went kinda nuts. It took him a few days to gather the courage to approach me, but when he did that day in the cafeteria, there was no stopping him. Rick talked. A lot. He had all these ideas for my YouTube channel. Ideas that even I, as a forward-thinking and imaginative individual, could clearly tell were too ambitious. Now, I was out there making COD fail videos, SpongeBob memes, and Counter-Strike parkour videos while talking about the latest online drama. Rick basically wanted us to make a goddamn feature film. I wouldn't have minded so much about Rick sitting at the cafeteria table with me every free period. Nobody else really did, and they were a bit intimidated by me being a big YouTuber, except for the fact that Rick stunk. And now, excuse my language, but he smelled like Jason Momoa's armpit hair. In the end, my nasal cavities couldn't put up with Rick's stink anymore, so I told him that I just wasn't interested in his stupid video ideas. And I could see the tears welling up in this kid's eyes as I told him the home truths he needed to hear, and I thought that'd be the end of it. But no, I kept finding notes in the common room, the cafeteria, and all of my classrooms pinned to the notice board and the whiteboard. Sometimes they'd just say, "Make videos with me, please, Rick." And other times they'd be an entire page describing some idea about an entire zombie movie that he wanted us to film and release on my YouTube channel. And the more I found the notes, the more Rick kept bragging about how his YouTube channel was growing. So in the end, I looked up the channel name that he'd given me, Ricky Dicky Davy, it's thankfully gone now, and saw that the chode had 8 subscribers. Effing heck, mate. I subscribe anyway, out of pity. Big mistake, I think, and this inspired Rick to start posting. A lot. But he didn't just post the usual YTPs or takedowns of Pokemon or Content Cop or elephants pooping at the zoo. No. Every video he posted was a clip of behind the scenes of a famous YouTuber. He didn't say a famous YouTuber. He said my username, but I don't want to do too much self-promotion here. It was crazy. The dude had been filming me all around college, from a distance, eating alone in a cafe, hanging out on the quad smoking a cigarette, playing squash in the gym, coming out of the changing rooms all sweaty. And I kid you not, he filmed me in the changing rooms, not naked thankfully, but titled, "Famous YouTuber Works Hard for His Fans." Now, I could immediately tell this was stalking, pure and simple. Now, I'd had enough of this Rick guy. I found him spying on me one day and took his digital camera and smashed it to pieces on the ground. I slammed him up against a wall and told him that if he ever filmed me ever again, if I ever saw him on my channel again, I would ruin his life with all of the power of a certain Chan-based message board who I had a good relationship with thanks to my videos. I thought Rick got the message. I got an in-school suspension for fighting, but it was worth it. Rick left the school at the end of the term, but not before telling me he'd get even with me. I thought nothing more of the confused little prick for 3 years. He never uploaded again, and I went off to college and continued my career. Things weren't great. I struggled to make friends and then hit rock bottom when my girlfriend left me, and I'd never know what true suffering was like until then. I became a bit of a shut-in for a while, but eventually got over it and became a party animal. Filming it all, of course. And speaking of filming, there was one final twist in the tale. One day, I get an alert on YouTube saying that Ricky Dicky Davy has uploaded, and so I click the video out of morbid curiosity. It's a series of videos, in fact. A series of videos taken on a handheld camera of filming a house at night from outside. My house. My shared house at college. Somehow Rick had tracked me down. I watched in horror as he just filmed me through my living room doing my stretches and exercises and playing the PlayStation. And that was all. Just hours and hours of footage of me doing nothing. The video ended with a movie maker text saying, "This is the price of fame." Then Rick walked back towards the camera, showing a steaming turd on my driveway. A turd that I remembered picking up that morning and believing it to belong to the dog next door. Ricky Ticky Davy's channel is now gone. Mine's still up, and again, I'd really appreciate a shout out to the channel if you read the story. But even though I only have a few thousand followers and I've moved twice since the events of this story, I still live in fear that one day, Stinky Rick will find me and make me the subject of his new video, and this time, it'll be a snuff film. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over to my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks and bonus content from members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. And I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. Please go subscribe. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, trail mix is human kibble.